how well did your grandfather know Joseph Kennedy?
They did business together in the bootlegging times, and my grandfather didn't like him because they were smuggling immigrants and they were smuggling alcohol or whiskey. And if they were getting chased and they needed to, lighten the load, they would throw the people overboard, the immigrants overboard before the alcohol. And my grandfather just, hated Joe Kennedy because of that.
Dorey, I got to tell you, man, you are a spitting image of your grandfather in the face. It's kind of trippy.
Well, I'll take that as a compliment.
It is. It is. I think about that famous picture. I'll put it in the corner of the screen from the cover of Esquire when he was like a really young man. And like when you line that up and then you look at your face, it's like it's all there.
Yeah. Well, like I said, thank you. I'll take it as a compliment.
But you guys have, for people out there listening, I know a lot of people are very into the mafia and the history and really all the things that it affected in this country, and not just talking about like crime, like, there's a lot of buildings in New York that went up with the permission of the mob, for example.
Right.
And, it doesn't mean though that everyone who's even a fan of that is completely familiar with what is maybe the most unique family history in the history of the Italian-American mafia with the Bonannos.
Yeah. I mean, and recently, somebody compared the five families, to basically the founding fathers. I think that's a bit of a stretch, but I got his, his sentiments were, yeah, you're right. It's part of history. It's part of American history. It's part of history that people seem to be very intrigued with, and so that's part of why I'm doing this, is to get it straight, because my grandfather always felt that he was a little bit misunderstood and. Kind of unfairly characterized as this guy that was, wanted to be the boss of bosses, where that definitely was not a term he liked at all. He wanted, he didn't even like, he felt there was a big difference between boss and a family, right? A family had a father and a boss, because a family and a corporation were very different things. And he kind of resented that, in America, people started to, equate those things. And then over the 30 years, from the 30s to the 50s, a lot of, corporate America kind of adopted the structure of, what they had built with the commission and, driving around in big black cars and all that. With, they were fans,
That's for lack of a better term.
Right.
I could see
that's
that.
Kind of the general term I use. They were fans, they were, welcomed him and wanted to be seen with him and, take pictures with him. And, he was, he had celebrity status in what he called the volcano in New York City.
The volcano. I never heard that. That's pretty good.
Yeah. He always referred to it as the volcano.
Why? Did he say why?
Yeah. Because it was just so tumultuous and there's always something going off and happening. And, he would go out to, Long Island and stuff and his dairy farm to relax. But when he was in the volcano, he always felt that he was inside of it. And, the way in his book, he talks about that quite a bit, and how New York was just, the energy and the, all that was going on was pretty intense.
Yeah, it was. And we'll definitely talk about his book today, because that's a whole separate story as well, with everything that happened afterwards, with that coming out back in 1983. But before we get to your grandfather, which is a whole, I think it's really important to paint like where his life started and how he brought that mentality over here and everything. But before we get there, you were born roughly in New York. Like, you grew up when you were at your youngest in New York, right?
Yeah, from the time I was 1 to 5,
okay.
Basically. We lived out in Long Island, and that was the time when, the war was, the banana wars were starting. We had a house with a basement, and in that basement, had all kinds of supplies and, a number of cots. I mean, it was basically, they were supporting an army, and that's what it looked like. And, there were guns, there were ammo, there were food, there were cots, there were, everything needed to, to conduct a war.
And you're just a little kid seeing that, so you have like no concept of what that
right.
is.
As a little kid, it's your normal, right? Yeah. Of course, they're all uncle. Uncle Carl, Uncle Frank, and they loved, as a little kid, I loved to roughhouse with them and, play with them and did not, you don't know anything's different when you're a kid. It's not till you get older when people start saying, wow, really? That's really happening? Yeah. And then when you realize, oh, yeah, that was kind of, I just went out here.
Oh, your thing right there? Yeah, don't. If it, just twist it like that and it'll be good. But the mics are good when that happens.
Oh, okay. So, yeah, it was normal to us. We did not, at the time, have any idea. I mean, it was extraordinary, but you don't know it as a kid. It's just you roll with it. And, as a little kid, and then when you get older and people start saying stuff, and that's when you realize, you start to look and ask questions, is when outsiders start saying, why is this happening, why is that happening, or we read an article in the paper that said this, and I didn't see the article, but when they mentioned it, and then you go back and, hey Mom, do you know what they're talking about? Then you go find out.
And it's because your dad, I mean, we were talking about your grandfather, but your dad, who's obviously your grandfather's son, he was the number 2 in the Bonanno family. Correct. During this time period when you were a kid in New York.
Right, absolutely.
So he was born into it. It sounds like at some point in his teenage years, your grandfather kind of explained to him how things were, and then he started moving towards that life immediately.
No, my grandfather didn't want, their goal was to have that next generation, my dad's generation, become lawyers and doctors and project managers and teachers and stuff like that. Well, when Grandpa, was hoping that he would become a lawyer. He was going to U of A, he was studying law, but the circumstances called him basically to New York, and have been raised, by my grandfather. He knew, he was aware, and he knew what he was supposed to do, and it was not even a question for him. He just, that's just the way he was wired. Was he was going to go and do what he could to help his father out, and put his life on hold basically because of his sense of duty.
What did your grandpa think of that though? Because he, as you said, like he wanted them, he envisioned his kids becoming like the lawyers and professionals, or quote unquote, in society, and not having to do what he did as a first generation immigrant. In that case, your grandfather was. The kids aren't. Like, what did he at first resist that in any way? Like, no, don't do this? Or was it like, okay, you want to do this? Let's go. Well,
when my dad, stepped up, Grandpa was, away. He had gotten kidnapped, or whatever you want to call that. He'd been abducted, and, Dad kind of had to, step in. And, I don't think, Grandpa liked that, the idea, but I think he liked that, it was my dad and he could trust him, and he knew my dad would, follow him, and he was completely loyal, where the other guys, yeah, he had, strong ties with some of those guys, but his son was, he was more comfortable with that.
Yeah, it's interesting when you think about the parallels between The Godfather and where, like the movie, and where they took inspiration from. There's clearly several elements that specifically come from your father and your grandfather. I mean, and right there alone, you talk about, and we'll get to like the background later, but the time period where your grandfather was abducted and all that in the early 60s, it's very similar to like when Vito Corleone was out of commission and Michael, who wasn't supposed to be a part of that life, stepped up and took care of business. Right. Very, very similar line right there, along with some other things, for sure.
There's a lot of, a lot of indicators that Michael was basically modeled after my dad, and you can say that Don Corleone was modeled after Joe Bonanno. There was never, I don't think Mario Puzo ever said that officially, but, he grew up in the neighborhood. He knew who they were. The wedding scenes were, I don't know, they look like could be one of our family weddings, right?
Well, the wedding in The Godfather was based off of your father's wedding. That one we know for sure. You stole my
punchline, right? Yeah. So anyway, but yeah, that's where I was going with that. Exactly, right? Because they had this, huge, wedding, and, thousands of people, and, the Waldorf Astoria wasn't even big enough, so they had to have it. I think it was called the Astor Hotel in New York at the time. Was the biggest, and they had congressmen and senators, and then everybody from their world even enemies showed up. You know, they were smart enough to sit them at different ends of the reception hall. You know, but they all showed up out of respect for my grandfather because, you know, in '56 when they got married, I mean that was the height. You know, that was his heyday.
Yeah.
You know, he had 25 years or so of basically peace, and you know they were making money. All the 5 families were prospering under this peace that he had put carefully crafted.
And they called that like Pax Bonanno, I think. Literally,
he did call
right?
that Pax Bonanno, right?
Yeah.
That's exactly what he liked that term, and he was very proud of that.
Yeah, he's such an interesting guy because when you think about the stereotypical over time historical mafia figures, one thing a lot of them have in common is that they're not the brightest bulbs. But
Right.
your grandfather and your father were like Renaissance men. They were extremely intelligent, well-educated, went to college, the whole nine. So I always wondered like how that played out behind the scenes, because there is a thing there where it's like, your grandpa speaks 7 languages, all this stuff, and then he's talking to some guy named Vinny who's like, you want me to whack him?
Yeah.
There's clearly like a little bit of a divide there, no?
Absolutely. His one of his main skills was being able to read people, right? Whether he was talking with, a thug or, some sort of intellect, he can talk to people on both ends of that spectrum. And because he respected people for who they were. He had a story. He would say, if I'm in charge and I ask this guy who can only carry 10 pounds, if I ask him to carry 20 pounds, worth of whatever up a hill, and he fails, that's the boss's fault, because he should know that employee or that soldier, whoever, whatever, can only carry 10 pounds. And it's up to the boss to know that. So he was really good at reading people, and he took time, and he prided himself on being able to judge somebody's character pretty quickly. And I think that's what gave him the ability to, work across that spectrum of people that he had to deal with on a daily basis.
No doubt. Now, where was he born?
My grandfather?
Yes, your grandfather.
Yeah, he was born in Castellammarese.
In Sicily.
Well, yeah. Yeah, we might have to edit this part because it's a little he might he was born in Sicily. They went there when he was young. Then he went back to Sicily. His father got called back.
They went to America when he was young.
They went to that's what I meant. You're right.
Right.
They went from Sicily to America and then back to Sicily when his father, things had fallen apart in Sicily. There was troubles, so his father went back to deal with those things, and took his family back.
And his father was a part of the Sicilian mafia over there.
But back then, back there it was just it was clans and the way they ran things. There was no separate organization. It was that's the way they did things in Sicily. So.
Right.
But yeah, he was born in Castellammarese del Golfo.
So he's born there, spends a couple years, whatever, comes over to America. And then my understanding was it was like maybe when he was like 13 or something, he came back to Castellammarese. Mm-hmm. So he was born and raised in a Sicilian household in New York during the time where, it was all the immigrants living together and stuff. So your grandfather had a very thick Sicilian accent that he maintained his whole life.
Yeah,
speaking English.
Absolutely. And it's one of the things that he was always, a little bit embarrassed about, that he could never really master the English language. He was articulate and all, but he definitely had that, that thick accent that made it sometimes difficult for people to understand him. And then, the way he talked in phrases and parables and, wasn't easy to follow either. So between the high intellect, the accent, and then just the contents of the story he was telling, because he didn't tell frivolous stories about a football game or anything. It was always some story that had some historical significance, or there was always a moral to the story that he was telling you.
Well, he was really into studying like history, right? Like
Absolutely.
He was very into like the classics and Greek mythology and stuff like that.
Absolutely, yeah. And he could quote the Odyssey and Iliad and Machiavelli, and he just bring that up from memory, and he was a very intelligent man. He can navigate from the stars, and he was definitely, like you said, a Renaissance man.
Yeah, like language is so interesting to me, how it's like ingrained in people with how they train their mouth as a young kid to talk, because your grandfather's a unique scenario where he was born there, came over very young, was here for some years, but then went back soon enough to where then he's speaking Sicilian every day, and he doesn't have like the parts of the mouth, say, that Americans use to speak English or whatever, so then he speaks with an accent. Whereas a guy like Lucky Luciano is born in Sicily, spends like the first, I think it was, he spent like the first 7 years of his life there, comes to America, and he's got a thick New York accent.
Right,
You know what I mean? It's nuts.
Yeah, he was, fully indoctrinated. Grandpa used to refer to him as kind of the Americanized, and liked him, and got along. They did business together for a lot of years, but always felt that he was more concerned with making money than anything else, and grandfather didn't quite see it that way. He wanted he was talking about he was more concerned with the structure of the family, and living by the code. And priding himself on that, where if they made money because of their dealings, that was great, but it wasn't his main focus, and that was what he said was the difference between him and Lucky.
Right.
So,
well, when he came back over to Sicily, I think that was when his father died, right?
Yeah, he got recruited to go to the war. It was World War I. He got injured, and apparently when he came back, he was never the same, and he passed away from his injuries.
Got it. Okay, so your grandfather goes over. He's still going through school, gets a college education, whatever. Like, at what point does he? Because again, it wasn't like here. It was, as you said, your word, like it was more like clans and stuff over there at the time. Right. At what point did he like say, "Oh, I'm gonna go do this now," and go back to America and get involved with the mafia?
He was going to this naval academy in Sicily, and Mussolini was just coming to power. And they used to wear white shirts, all the cadets or whatever they call them in Sicily. We call them cadets that are going to this naval academy. And Mussolini came in and wanted them to all wear black shirts. Well, he wasn't gonna do that. And the next day they were supposed to show up in black shirts. He didn't show up. He showed up in his regular white uniform. And then the next day they said, if you don't show up with your black shirts, you're going to get expelled. And he just didn't show up in any shirt. He just didn't show up, and he knew he was going to be in trouble. And that's when he said, "I'm going to him." Well, he was leaving. He didn't know where he was going, but then it ended up he was going to America, and that's
right.
Because he had been there as a younger kid, and he made his way back.
Hey guys, if you're enjoying this episode, please be sure to share it around on social media and with your friends. Sharing the show and spreading the word is the best possible thing we can do to grow the show and continue to get great guests like this. So thank you to all of you who have done that, and thank you to all of you who are going to do it now. And also, if you haven't already subscribed and liked the video, please do that. And if you're on Apple or Spotify, please leave a 5-star review if you get a chance. That is a huge, huge help. And thank you to all of you who have already done so. And how did he, like, when he came over, he obviously got involved right away, and he had contacts, obviously, from living here and everything, also considering his dad probably knew all these guys because he was involved. Right. But this was before, like, it's interesting that you talk about Sicily as these clans and stuff, because I almost forget, it kind of was like that in America at the time, too, because they hadn't, quote-unquote, organized it yet. That story still had to play out, like with Lucky and the 5 families and everything and all that.
That came later, absolutely.
Right.
Yeah.
So when he came to America, it's a very similar setup to Sicily at the time, no?
Right, because they were, the same people. They were just in a different place, but their, societal norms were, what they knew from the old country. So, they stuck together because there was all kinds of other, immigrants. There was the Irish and the Germans and the Polish, and, so they all stuck together. But the Sicilians, the Castellammarese, particularly, stuck together and stuck to their old ways. They brought their old ways with them because that's what they knew, right? And they weren't, they weren't really welcomed with open arms. I mean, there were so many immigrants back then. They were just, they weren't. I don't think they have a tough time they have today, but they weren't rolling out the red carpet. They were just people coming all the time, and they didn't know what to do with them.
Yeah, and it also seems like the Castellammarese, more than anyone else in Sicily, stuck together, because like when you hear about other guys who were from other towns in Sicily, whatever might be, it could be Palermo or a really small town no one's heard of. It's like there weren't like clans like that. Whereas when you look through mafia history, they're constantly saying like, "Oh, he was a Castellammarese," right? Like that family was comprised of a lot of Castellammarese. Like that was always curious to me. Like, why was it so much different with that one place as opposed to the rest of the island?
I think it was the way they were raised, and from day one, it was always the greater good. The group is more important. The family is more important than the individual, right? You're part of this family, and what you do is a reflection of that family, and you're responsible for keeping that name up. And I think they just had it indoctrinated from day one that there was something bigger than self. Where in a lot of other places, well, especially in America, it's all about the individual and being able to make your own way, and that's the American dream. Well, in Sicily and specifically in Castellammarese, they were, it's the family was more important, the greater good.
Yeah, that's a funny dichotomy there too.
It is.
Because you think about it, the idea of a family at least is a group. It's like it's the smallest, tightest community, but it's like it's a community. It's your blood. And then in America, it's like, oh, you're out for yourself to make money. But America, the idea was built on it's the land of the free, of the American dream, where we collectively are this great thing because we can trust in the system. Whereas in Sicily, this is an island that's been conquered a million fucking times. Right. They've had no competent government. They've had total corruption, killers in the government way before Mussolini and all that. So it's like it was ingrained in their bloodlines to not trust anything down to the mayor of the town, but they went towards, like, out of that, they went towards the theme of like, all right, well, pick the people you can trust. Whereas in America, the system's better, but people are more like, all right, what's in it for me? That's really interesting.
Absolutely. I mean, because he saw that back to that comment I made about the difference between a father and a boss, where a boss, they have a goal to produce whatever widget, right? To make something, to be, have this monetary reward, where the role of a father in a family is to make sure everybody's doing all right, to make sure everybody has what they need, to be their best self, to succeed. Where, boss is only worried about what's best for the end result, the bottom line. Where a father may make a decision that may not be beneficial financially, but it benefits, his son or one of his or one of the people that he considers, part of his family. So it's not all based on, what's going to help the bottom line. It's what's going to help this person, like a father would do, right? A good father anyway, would be more concerned with, making sure his child has what he needs as opposed to being able to make more money. Well, I would hope, good fathers thought that way.
Yeah. So, that makes total sense.
So it's a fine, distinction between a boss and a father, but it's pretty important, and it was important to him. And like I said, he didn't like being called boss. He wanted to be known as a father. Because he saw himself more as a father figure than, a boss.
And you guys called him, I was just listening to how you said it, you called him grandfather. You didn't call him like
grandpa. Yeah, we called him grandpa.
Oh, you did call him grandpa.
Yeah, and because they had a different mentality. They wanted us to become assimilated. They didn't speak Sicilian to us in the house because they didn't want us to have accents. They didn't want us to, be thinking in Sicilian and then have to translate to English. It was always English to us, and they did not want, not that they were ashamed of being a Sicilian, but they thought it was very important that we got assimilated into the, as Americans as soon as we could. And, he wanted the goal to be, he wanted his son to be a lawyer, and, he didn't want his son to get involved. His son didn't get involved, but the next step was, our generation, and none of us are, in the game.
Right.
We're all professionals, like, teachers, doctors, lawyers.
Hey, your brother's like a pediatrician.
And he's a pediatrician, right. And so that was, mission accomplished, right? So
took one extra generation, but that worked out.
It didn't happen as fast as they wanted, but it did happen. And I think he took a lot of pride in that.
There's a lot to unpack there that I'm going to wait on, because I want to like lay out so that people can understand exactly how your grandfather's career went and then what led to like the book and all that. I think we could really unpack that later. But to get back to like when his father died, even right before he came back to America, because you're bringing up this whole, he looked at himself as a father point. Right. Is that while Mussolini coming into power clearly was like the straw that broke the camel's back and made him say, all right, I'm getting out of the Naval Academy here and going over, we're going to figure this out. Like, did he, when your grandfather's father died, it sounds like he was obviously extremely close with him, but did he then kind of have that thing where he's a teenager and he's like, okay, well, I have to grow up immediately now and I need to take care of everyone? Like, was that just like he stepped into that mode?
Not initially. He was pretty young, but he had some uncles from on his mother's side and his cousins, the Magadinos, that kind of took him in, and it was kind of thrust upon him. He had to step up because there was some problems in Sicily, if I remember right, and it just He had a choice that he could have become, like one of his uncles was in the seminary. He could have studied to become a priest, but one of the other uncles had an issue, and he stepped in and, entered the life, so to speak.
Crazy how life forks like that. It's like it could be that far, like priest or like mobster.
Right, and that was really when it comes down to it. That's kind of the choice he had.
So he comes over to America, and he finds, through the contacts he had established, he immediately gets in with some of his Castellammarese guys. And was he working for Maranzano right away, or did that eventually occur?
It didn't happen right away. It happened eventually. He ran into, like you said, some of his buddies from Castellammarese, and they, back then, all the Sicilians had stills because they were making their own wine.
This is like 1920,
in the 24? Exactly.
Got it.
And then through that, Maranzano came, and they latched onto each other. He really admired Maranzano and the way he was, the way he dressed, his mannerisms, the way he made decisions, and learned a lot from him. And Maranzano liked that, and had him progress through the system until when Maranzano ended up being murdered. My grandfather took over.
Yeah, that's a whole story that we'll talk about in a sec. Right. But when he gets there in like 23, 24, even before he meets Maranzano, I would assume pretty much the whole focus of the business was just Prohibition, because like that's where the mob was spending all their resources on business, right?
He tried to become a dentist. He had an uncle that was, not a dentist, a barber and a baker. One of his other uncles had a bakery, and he went in business. He drove the truck, and he was going to do sales and help the bakery grow, but he wasn't just wasn't cut out for that. And then when he met his buddies who had a still running, and they were they were kind of living a more exciting life than driving a bakery truck, and he got sucked in, and yes. That was and then Prohibition kind of, was a gift for them. The way they saw
thing ever.
Right? It's like, are you kidding me? They're going to outlaw this stuff, and it worked out for them absolutely.
Yeah, there's a really underrated show that was phenomenal from a historical perspective, even though they fictionalized like some of the main characters, called Boardwalk Empire.
Oh yeah,
you ever see that?
Yeah.
They had a lot of this era covered in that, because that takes place during Prohibition, focused on Atlantic City, where that was a popular place to smuggle in a lot of hooch. But like, your grandfather was actually in it at the very end.
I was going to say,
the whole thing covered like the formation of the Italian American mafia as we know it. And it's like, this was the most obvious thing ever. Like, people aren't going to give up drinking, and someone's going to, it's like, I can't even believe that was like an idea in Congress where they're thinking, this is a good one. Nothing bad will happen here.
Yeah, what could go wrong? But yeah, he definitely saw it as a gift, and it was. I mean, it was right up their alley, and they created this whole market, this whole need, and they just filled that need.
And where was he? Like, did you ever get some stories from him, like where he was running alcohol to, or what his role in a lot of that was while Prohibition was at its height? No.
And it's not something he would have talked to his grandchildren about. He was very much, when he did talk to us, he had a point he wanted to make. There's a story, there's a moral to the story that he wanted to tell. So he would tell stories about the Odyssey or historical things, he wouldn't, even, if I would ask him, you would get this look. Well, we just knew intrinsically you don't ask those kind of questions, right?
Right.
It just because you wouldn't, if you might get slapped at the very, extreme, but you might just get ignored. They're like, you don't ask questions. You don't ask those kind of questions. And I never did.
Did your dad ask those questions?
I don't think he did. I think if my dad knew that, if he needed to know, Grandpa would tell him, right? That's just the way it was. You didn't, you didn't ask questions because they took offense to it. If the phone rings and you pick up the phone, you never said, "Well, who is it?" You just
taught that at a young age, I guess, right?
You just knew. You don't ask, questions like, when my dad came home late, my mom would never say, "Well, where you been?" That's not how it worked,
That's just it's a cultural thing,
right?
It's like it's got to be ingrained in.
Right,
There's
and
no
when I was first married, I had a real hard time with, even telling my wife where I was going because I felt like that was a violation because right, I don't have to, you don't ask me where I've been, and I don't tell you where I'm going, and it was kind of a hard adjustment to to say because that's what was modeled for me, right? Mom didn't ask, and of course that's my normal, right? That's what I knew. And then, when I got married, it was a source of difficulty.
It's a passed down thing for sure because it makes sense considering that the way we think in America of like the Wild Wild West back in the 1800s and stuff, that's really, it's not a far cry from how Sicily was and actually in some ways continues to be. Right. It's really, I can imagine that when, you look at different, say, smaller ethnic groups around the world who there's just a thing that's built in, like especially they've been persecuted. You look at like the Jewish people or something like that. Like it's unspoken. They just get it. Like we gotta look out for each other because people tried to kill us not that long ago. Right. And when you're in Sicily, it's like we gotta look out for each other because we're always getting conquered. Right. So you don't tell anyone nothing.
We don't care who's in charge because we're gonna do our same thing because we know they're gonna come and go and we're gonna be here.
That's it. And this guy Maranzano, for people who haven't heard of him, as we said, he was a Castellammarese. But he was a little crazy, but he was one of the other guys who was really intelligent. Like he was like your grandfather,
man,
right? Like Renaissance type guy. So your grandfather really took a liking to him through that. And then it sounds like he was, based on your grandfather's telling of it, he was pretty quickly like kind of his right hand. No?
Yeah, he came up through the ranks pretty quickly, and he was singled out as somebody that understood Maranzano, and then he admired him so much. I think that definitely helped, helped his rise in the organization.
And so, you had mentioned Maranzano was murdered. This was like this is right towards the end of Prohibition, like 1931, I think.
In that time frame, yeah.
Right. So the broad strokes of what was happening is you had the American side, as your grandfather would call it, like the Lucky Lucianos of the world.
Americanized, yeah.
They didn't like Maranzano and like Paul Masseria and those old school guys, right?
Well, yeah, and Masseria was more on the the Americanized side where, and I think the delineation is that those who put money for making money first, as opposed to those who wanted to keep the structure of the family as the main goal. And I think that was the difference. The old school guys wanted to keep the old traditions, where the Masseria and then his the people that took over for him, they wanted to make money. It was definitely a business, and what they like I said, it goes back to that whole discussion between what's a father and a boss and what that difference is.
Did those like you think about the scenes that are painted in like Godfather 2, especially in both of the first two movies, but especially Godfather 2, where you see like young Vito Corleone. There's the element where he becomes the Don of the neighborhood, right? So people end up coming to him. They ask, for a favor, or someone had something horrible happen to them and they don't want to go to the police because they don't trust them, and they go to this guy who they trust, even though he's like the head of the criminal organization. It's like, well, no, he's the head of our neighborhood. The guys like Luciano, though, did they really have that, or was that more like on your grandfather's end? Like he viewed it, he and Maranzano viewed things like, oh, we got to do that too.
Well, yeah, I mean, from my perspective, that's exactly it, right? My grandfather was more of in the family and in the traditional structure of things, where guys like Luciano and all those that followed in the 80s and 90s and up to today were more about just making money, and not caring about the structure and following the code. It was like the ends. Well, we're making money, so it's okay. Well, even if my grandfather was making good money at something, if it wasn't following his code, he just wouldn't do it.
And again, we're going to define that code as we go along here. For people listening, they're like, wait, what code? But he literally wrote about it in a book called Man of Honor. But the Maranzano thing, it happened twice technically, because the guy who we mentioned, Joe Masseria, they killed him. Mm-hmm. Like, I guess Lucky worked for him and Frank Costello. Right. They got rid of him. They made a deal with Maranzano, like, okay, we're with you now. But then very quickly they thought Maranzano thought he was like Julius fucking Caesar or something. Exactly. And so they're like, well, he's got to go. But they didn't tell your grandfather that they were going to hit him. Right.
No, because he was too close to him, right? If he had known, he would have been honor bound to do something about it.
Right.
So, he really didn't, get with or meet. I think he probably met Lucky before that, but didn't have dealings with him until after Maranzano died. And that's when, they had to come together, because they were basically the bosses of two of the main families.
And that's the question I have here, because your grandfather was a really young man. He was like 25 or 26. He had started young with all this. So once they kill Maranzano, well, he can't prevent it now. Honor bound to prevent it because it's over, obviously. He's dead.
It happened.
But he meets with Luciano and they make peace.
Right.
Did he not think like, oh, I need to avenge that according to his code, or he put that aside? Well, what was the logic?
The logic was that he had heard stories about that Maranzano was trying to had a hit out or a contract out on Lucky and some of the other guys, right? So they were just basically self-defense, and he believed that story, right? Maranzano didn't tell him he was going after Lucky ahead of time. But when he did his due diligence and looked into it and was satisfied that he was acting out of his self-preservation, he wasn't going to go after Maranzano until Maranzano started coming after him, and then he got to him first.
So yeah, that's interesting, because I actually buy that too. I'll bet that probably was the case, because they never, according to pretty much any research on it, they really never got along, even when, like Lucky and Maranzano and stuff, like even when they hit Masseria and kind of vacuum powered the thing, like they still
never got right.
Yeah.
That's the sense I got too from what I know, but just from reading different things.
So your grandfather, and this is why it's like so crazy that he lived so long, and then what ended up happening with him in retirement and all that, and like having a lot of years outside of it afterwards, like his whole story from immigrant all the way through it, the perhaps the craziest part of it is he was alive 40 years after, and 30, 40 years after all these other guys who were there when they formed this thing. Because when Maranzano gets hit, now Luciano clearly is like the dog around here, and they form what's known as the Commission. And so for people listening who aren't familiar with the Mafia, can you explain what that is?
Well, the Commission was, the five families, the five families coming together and having, instead of having a boss of bosses, because Maranzano considered himself, I think he was the last one to officially use the title of boss of bosses. Well, they wanted to replace that one guy with a group, with the heads of the five families, and that was what it was intended for, was to keep the peace between the families. And they decided it would be best if they cooperated, because if they kept fighting each other, no one was going to make money. So Luciano, my grandfather, got together, and they decided that they would make this commission to avoid having one guy that can call the shots for everybody.
Was that the meeting? Was that like the big meeting to say like, all right, we're going to call a meeting to do this now with everybody, where it was just your grandfather, who was from the Maranzano faction, meeting with the guy who had just Vacuum Power, Luciano. It's pretty much the two of
That's
them.
the way I understand it. That was the genesis of it. Yeah.
Wow. That's crazy. That's historically
Pretty amazing, right?
That's nuts. So
For
then
what they accomplished over the next 30, 40 years, yeah.
yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, they rose to power, and they had influence in World War II, and
We'll talk about that
right,
for sure.
Yeah, so it was pretty incredible.
So they then have a meeting where, the five families, most people know they're based in New York. They technically have operations in other places like Jersey and Florida, and eventually even Vegas and stuff like that as well. But the commission, they did allow, I think right away, the only other faction that was allowed, I might be wrong about this, but the only other faction outside the five New York families that was allowed on there was the Chicago outfit. And then eventually, I don't know when, but eventually they gave Philadelphia a seat. They gave Traficante.
First it was Buffalo. Magadino was my grandfather's cousin.
Right.
So he was also part of the Buffalo family, even though it was a small town. It was very influential in the whole path between Canada and all the stuff they did with alcohol and cigarettes with Canada. So Buffalo was really important, but Buffalo was the next one, and then Chicago, Philadelphia, and Detroit.
Got it. Okay. So eventually it all expanded.
And then right.
At first, it was just pretty much New York and Chicago and Buffalo in this case.
Right.
So the way they would do it is the heads of each of those families would be the ones who meet to discuss, like a board meeting, like discuss what's going on with crime, who's got what, make peace and continue to be able to operate so everyone makes money.
Right. And mostly it was, from my understanding, it was to settle any sort of disputes, right? They would come together when there was something that was, a major issue, and people are about to go to war. Well, let's go and sit around a table and see if we can't figure this out. Let cooler heads prevail. So when you got a lot of these hotheads and guys that feel disrespected, they just want to go after it. But there was a way, and they made this structure so they can resolve those issues without having to kill each other and constantly going to war and costing everybody money, and nobody's making any money. If you're paying for a war, it's tough on everybody. And they were able to keep that peace for a long time because they had that way to resolve the issues. Right? They had the dons, the fathers could get together and make a decision, and then it was binding, and they all bought in on that, and it put the organization into organized crime.
Yeah, it's really like,
and that's what the case was about in the 80s, right?
Yeah,
So.
yeah, and that's kind of the full circle where it went bad because the government caught up in like how to actually get to the top with RICO and all that. But it's such a long time later. Like they, from the 30s, because they formed the commission in like 1931-ish, from the 30s through when your grandfather went out to Arizona, I mean, they operated carte blanche.
Pretty much. And it was that structure of having the commission.
Pull that mic in just a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, having the commission and having that structure, like I said, gave them a way to settle disputes. And when when their bodies weren't piling up on the streets, they were making money. When everybody was, happy and getting along, business was better.
But they also had, they formed stuff like Murder Inc. still, right?
Right. Things happened within the families, right? So the commission couldn't tell the Bonanno family or the Colombo family what they could do within their family. There was no, they didn't, that was part of the commission. Hey, what happens in your, we only talk about things that, where our worlds intersect, but within your family, with whatever you guys want to do, none of the bosses were going to agree to, have them get in at that micro level. This was a macro thing for the disputes between the families and the turf wars, and if they're going after the same things, they found a way to split it.
How did they? I don't know if I've ever really properly researched this question, so this might be a good one to ask. But when you think about the mafia, everyone can start to name like the main businesses, right? So they can be like, okay, gambling, prostitution. Eventually there were some drugs as well, like extortion, loan sharking, yada, yada. But, for example, you have five families all operating across the different boroughs in New York, in other states where they're in similar neighborhoods and whatever. Like, how did they decide, say, at the beginning, okay, well, within gambling, you're going to do this thing, and that family's going to do that thing, and that family's going to do that thing?
I think it was they all did whatever they could do within their own families, whatever was available, whether it was numbers or, like you said, and my grandfather didn't he didn't believe in prostitution, so the Bonanno family wasn't into prostitution, and he wasn't into extortion just for protection. It was when people didn't pay him back, they went out, if you borrowed money and you didn't pay it back, then you had to pay the results. But the Bonanno family never just leaned on people just because they could. And he was not happy that he knew that went on with the other families where they would just lean on people because they could. He never felt that was right, and he never participated.
So they didn't do that.
Not the Bonanno family.
That's interesting.
He makes once again, in his book, he talks a lot about how he never, extortion just for extortion is wrong, because violence, the only justification for violence in his mind was to restore order. So when things were orderly and going along, violence, there was no need for violence, just, to collect an extra $100 or whatever from somebody. He didn't feel that was, within his code.
That is very interesting to me, because, I kind of treat, when you're looking at like the mob and organized crime, the guys in it, they know what they signed up for. Right. They're in that world. Like, I don't, someone kills someone, it's a bad thing. I don't mishear me here, but yes, there is a difference to me looking at a mobster who whacked another mobster versus some dude who killed his wife. There's no compare. You know what I mean? Like those are.
My dad had a great line for that. He used to say, "Nobody in the mob who ever got hit didn't know it was coming." Meaning, if you knew the rules, and if you broke the rules, you knew the results of that. Of that violation. It was not a mystery. It was not. Nobody was ever surprised by it. Right. Any of those guys that got hit, they knew they did something to somebody that caused that. It just didn't, they didn't just randomly hit anybody. It was, and, like you said, it wasn't wives, it wasn't children, it wasn't anybody else. It was the guy who, the perpetrator, he broke the code, he knew the price, and the price was paid.
And when that line has been crossed, in the mafia with people who aren't involved or people who were in the wrong place at the wrong time, that's where it gets scummy. And like, that's why it's interesting that you say that he was adamantly against the extortion, because I've always thought, especially when I've never been around it, but I know people who have fallen victim to it, say up in North Jersey and New York. It's like one of the worst things they do to this day is when someone just has a business, right? Like they literally just have a business somewhere and they got an Italian last name, and these guys walk in and say, you owe us 30%. Or we're going to break your legs or kill you, right? Like that's the extortion I'm talking about. So your grandfather wasn't about that.
Right. He that was not part of his code, and that's not something he ever endorsed or, didn't proliferate within his family when he was in charge. Now, what happened, anything that happened with the Bonanno family, in the 70s and 80s,
it's different.
It kept the name, but he wasn't, calling the shots. So, hence the French Connection and all the narcotics. And that's, yes, the Bonanno crime family. And Dad had another good way to delineate that when he talked about the Bonanno family with a capital F. He meant the crime family. And when he talked about Bonanno with family with a lowercase f, he was talking about, his guys and our cousins and our relatives. The people that were not necessarily the nuclear family, but just the guys, the made guys, the guys that he knew and whatever, the guys he made.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, like culturally though, too, because that's like part of the mystique of the Italian-American mafia is that it is Italian-American. Like you got to be, with very few exceptions, it's like you got to be full blood. And for a while there, it was like you literally got to be from Sicily. Eventually that changed a little bit. You could just be from you could be Neapolitan, something like that. But, a big difference between Lucky and your grandfather, again, like the Italian versus American side of it, is that Lucky growing up in New York, even though he lived in an Italian neighborhood, he grew up with a lot of guys who were Jewish and Irish. Some of his best friends, like Meyer Lansky, Bugsy Siegel, these were Jewish gangsters. And so even though he wasn't like, oh, we're going to induct these guys into the family, he's like, well, they're our partners. Right. Versus a guy like your grandfather was like, no, we only deal with our own kind. Right. So did he eventually like change his mind on that a little bit, or was that pretty much consistently like, we're only going to work with Italians?
He was, because he stuck to his code, and he only felt that the only people who can understand, his code were, fellow Sicilians, and he even had, problem with, Italians from, Naples and, Calabria. He always felt that they were them and they're not us. So
did he get along with Frank Costello?
He did.
Because Costello wasn't he Calabrian?
Yeah.
Yeah. So they were okay though?
Yeah, that was a different family, of course.
Yeah.
So, and once again, what happens in the other families,
So he had it clear.
Right.
It sounds like he viewed the commission as like, okay, this is good for business, so that we keep the peace. And other than that, you do your shit.
Right. You do what you do, and we'll do, the Sicilians will do what, we do and live by our code. And he took a lot of pride in that. And, there was a lot of animosity as a result of that, because the old school ways were, going by the wayside, in America, things were going in, especially the 40s and the 50s. And he was trying to stick to those old world ways. And, a lot of the guys didn't understand it, right? They weren't in Sicily. They didn't understand the need to, the strict adherence to the code, where he never relented on that.
Well, when the commission would go to approve things in the efforts of keeping the peace, for example, which did involve, in certain cases, certain guys had to go, obviously. Right. I had mentioned it before, but they did use things like Murder, Inc. So people who were involved in this were not necessarily Italian. There were a lot of guys who were Jewish and Irish gangsters involved with that. So when it came to business that he is technically a part of, where he's got to give an okay on stuff, he didn't have a problem with that. He was just like, okay, it's not Italians doing it, no problem.
No, I mean, that once again, it goes back to the individual families, and the father of that individual family could do, what he felt he had to do, as long as it wasn't impacting, any of the Bonanno interest or business. He felt he didn't have a say. He might have had an opinion, but he wasn't going to speak that opinion, or he wasn't going to, inhibit any other, father from doing what he thought was best, because he would definitely not tolerate some other father coming in and questioning him. Now, if there was an issue where they were both going after the same thing, or their interests clash, then you needed the commission to resolve those, and that's what it was for.
Okay, so even on that, he kind of had, that was just a cost of doing business. Got it.
Right.
So when Prohibition ended in 1932 or 33, somewhere right in there, they already obviously did have other rackets. Like they had gambling, they had things like that. You said your grandfather stayed away from prostitution and drugs, which again, you pointed out, but it is ironic because right after he left, the Bonannos were like the main drug dealing family of them all.
Right.
Crazy. But he stayed away from that stuff. How much, like in the 30s, not necessarily like what was the size of the family, but how much was business like badly impacted by the fact that they were no longer moving alcohol at 2,000% markups every week?
Well, I think the taxes on the cigarettes were a big thing, and that was always a good source of revenue, because they would get the cigarettes from Canada that didn't have the tax seal on them, and they were able to make a lot of money.
How does that work? Can you explain that?
Don't really understand exactly how it worked, but I know, all the American cigarettes had, even back in the day, there was always high taxes on cigarettes. And then if you can get them from Canada, they didn't have that. There's a stamp apparently on the bottom of packs of cigarettes, and that was the only difference. They didn't have any of the taxes. So they would bring tobacco, cigarettes down from Canada into New York.
Stamp it.
And no, they wouldn't. They just, they wouldn't pay the taxes, and they wouldn't collect taxes. So, whatever the tax was, the 8 or 10%, that's what they were making.
It's like a built-in markup. You're saying
built-in markup, and they made a lot of money with that. And then, with the garment district, they controlled basically the the clothing industry, and they had a lot of people working for them, and they kept the contracts coming in, and they were able to get that's where their connections and their force, but they were able to get a lot of those contracts. They were making boots, and like during World War II, boots and jackets, and they were all those contracts were going to their people in the garment district.
And they also had the unions, so they had like the docks and stuff. So like on imports, they knew when stuff was coming in.
Right.
They wanted to hit certain things or put a tax on certain things, right?
They could do all that, right?
Okay. And it's crazy. I've said this before in some other podcasts, just talking with people, but every time I drive down 78 coming into New York City, where you're on that strip in Jersey City where you can just see the whole skyline, never gets old to me. I love it. I love looking at it. It's just like this crazy thing that humans created going up into the sky here. I can't help, though, but think, looking at every single one of those buildings, I think to myself, I'm like, almost none of those went up without the okay and economic interests of the mafia signing
some
off.
way, some way, shape, or form. Yeah, it is pretty incredible when you look at it that way.
It's like all the cement down there, or like the zoning contracts. These were companies that they had a take on, or were literally. Sometimes they were like the president of the company itself, or like the union that the company used for the workers, and like. For better or worse, that's a part of history. Like they did that.
Right.
And a lot of this happened in the wake of the Great Depression afterwards, when they were trying to create jobs, put up buildings, and you just had this boom of all these amazing buildings built for 30, 40, 50, 60 years. And it's like they're in the middle of all of it there.
Absolutely.
And so they get through the 30s, though, and you've alluded to it a few times, but I think this is a great story. World War II. People don't realize that the mafia had a significant helping factor with the Allied invasion of Sicily, which is how we entered Europe. Right. So can you explain like what the history was there?
Well, in short, I a little bit of knowledge of it, not the the details, but in short, when they were going to go to Sicily, the Americans were smart enough to say, hey, we have all these Sicilians in New York that are Americans, that have some pride. Maybe they'll help us, and they were more than willing to do their part because they loved America for sure. I mean, it was a land of opportunity for them, like we were talking about earlier with the Prohibition. It was a gift, right? So they were very proud to be. My grandfather was a naturalized citizen, and they were very proud to be Americans, and they wanted to help in the war effort any way they could. And once again, they were presented with this opportunity where they could help the invading forces, and it worked. They went right through Sicily and right up through Italy, and they told the people in Sicily, "Hey, we need your help," and they did. They all fell in line, and because they didn't want Mussolini or Hitler or the fascists taking over. They wanted their freedom as well, and they admired America. So it was a natural thing for them to all team up and make that work.
Yeah, the one urban legend of that story that a lot of historians shoot down, but they're also kind of incentivized to shoot it down because it's like you don't want to admit that, like, oh, the mafia helped us.
Right.
But the one that I'm kind of on the fence about that I feel like might have been a bridge too far was when they talk about how Lucky Luciano arranged for them to do a flyover, and they dropped like little leaflets into the towns saying like we're coming, and letting like Don Carlo Vizzini and like some of the bosses there like know that way that that the forces were coming, and they'd help them get across the island. I don't know about that one, but they did have, I mean, they were able to get through that Operation Mincemeat thing, which was a movie that actually was just made with the whole British intelligence operation that tricked the Germans into thinking that they were going to invade Greece and not Sicily. They did get some of the Nazi soldiers off the island before they came, which helped. But once they landed, the guys like Calavizzini and the different bosses across the island who had strong ties to America, it wasn't the mayors meeting the troops.
Right,
it was the
heads.
bosses going, come with us. And they're like in the
Exactly.
tanks, like leading the way through. That's pretty fucking wild.
Absolutely. Yeah. It was definitely a source of pride for them. They felt like they swung the pendulum in the Americans' favor, through that, and they always took a lot of pride in that.
Yeah, and it's like one of the many things where the mafia is ingrained with like American history, with stuff. You could talk about the buildings, you could talk about that, you could talk about Kennedy, which we'll get to. It's like they're in the middle of all of this, so it's kind of like the government. You have the FBI and the police say like chasing these guys because they view them as street criminals, but then like the government's like, yeah, okay, that's fine, but also they have access, so we're gonna work with them.
Right. Well.
It's nuts. I don't know. But after World War II, this is all part of that like Pax Bonanno era. So your grandfather's just completely in power, at top of his game, I guess you could say. Did it all start to, I don't want to say fall apart, but like go the wrong way with the Apalachin meeting in 57? Like, is that how he looked at it?
Well, I mean, he was in Italy. He went to Sicily while all that came together, and he said had he been there, he would have not, that wouldn't have happened, because they had a national meeting the year before. They didn't need another meeting, and it got called because he was away, and that's the only reason it got there. And he didn't want to go. He thought it was a bad idea, and it was ended up being an awful idea, as we know. But yeah, he didn't. He wouldn't have allowed that to take place if had he been in in New York at the time when all that was coming together. But he was in Sicily and kind of enjoying his success a little bit.
Why did they have like? Because it's a commission meeting, and as you said, they had done it the year before. For people that don't know, this was 1957, town up in northern New York in the hills, and they accidentally got cited because there were like thousands of not thousands, hundreds,
right? But all
of
these big Cadillacs and cars rolling through this little town in upstate New York. Right. Yeah, it drew a little attention.
So the cops like descended upon it, and they're like, "Holy shit, this is the mother lode." Why was this meeting? Like, it wasn't just the bosses. They had all kinds of foot soldiers. Like, why would they do that at all, ever?
Yeah, it was just, it was somebody's pride, basically. Grandpa was away, and, Stefano Magaddino, they wanted to have this, show their prominence and have this meeting and have everybody come. And it was just basically flexing, I guess is the word they would use now. His cousin Stefano and their faction in the commission were, kind of showing that, well, Joe's away, we're in charge now. And it just all
wasn't good.
Wasn't good. So
your grandfather comes home after that, and now there's heat because this is like when the first hearings started happening after that, where TV is a thing now in black and white, and they're hauling some of these guys to Congress. I think they literally had Frank Costello there for some of the early ones. He was like, I guess the boss of what used to be Lucky's family at that point, and he's sitting in front of Congress on TV, going, "I played the fifth." Right. And you have all these normal American citizens like, what the fuck
is that?
What's going on here? It puts all the heat on them, and then. There was another guy,
Joe Pistone.
That's it.
Yeah. So
what was his story?
And he was just a low level, guy that during they were at war. All the source of all the commotion was the crazy Joe Gallo and trying to kill the Profaci, the head of the Profaci family, and then then they got Colombo, and they went to war and they started letting people in. That weren't Sicilian, they kind of, they needed soldiers. So their requirements, lowered. And a guy like Apalachin got in, and he was never met my grandfather. He never, he was a low-level soldier.
And what family?
I think it was Genovese family. I really don't recall exactly, but I think it was, the Genovese family. But he didn't, he wasn't really a hired guy, and he got a lot of things wrong in his testimony. He just, wanted to be in the spotlight and, said some things that were, he gave a lot of the secrets away for sure. Not really it was the American public, they didn't know about this stuff until Valachi came out and kind of laid it out for them and showed them how, that there was a structure and this was a real thing, and it's real something you should be concerned with.
Yeah, while you're talking, I'm pulling this up to see if there's like something quick we could show, but all the videos are kind of long on YouTube, but people can look it up. You can type in Valachi and you'll see like the video of him speaking at Congress, and he was like going through how the making ceremony works and all that. So this was out for the public to see, and that was really what it was. That was something he did get right. There
were some parts that were right, but there were a lot of key stuff and that was wrong. And I don't know. My grandfather talks about it in his book and just kind of dismisses it as this, they believed whatever this guy said, and he didn't really have a whole lot of knowledge. He knew some, but that was the first time the public really got a glimpse into the structure of it.
And so now there's some legitimate worry about order of business, because it's like, well, now we have heat. Now there's awareness. It's not just like the people in the neighborhoods that we operate in who know. There's people who are aware that there's something going on here. So even if the government had no ability to really get to the top of the structure at the time, which they didn't, because you have a boss and you have layers to it. Right. So you can't really, if some low-level soldier kills a guy, you can't technically tie it back to the boss at the time. So that wasn't a threat yet, but now it's like the eyeballs are on us. Right. So ironically, this is all happening when a former major bootlegger of the Irish-American faction happens to have his eyes on a son of his becoming president.
Right.
And that was Joseph Kennedy. So before we get into John F. Kennedy, how well did your grandfather know Joseph Kennedy? His father.
They did business together in the bootlegging, times. And my grandfather didn't like him because he apparently had the reputation, if one of his boats, they were smuggling immigrants and they were smuggling, alcohol or whiskey. And if they were getting chased and they needed to, lighten the load, they would throw the people overboard, the immigrants overboard before the alcohol. And my grandfather just, hated basically Joe Kennedy because of that.
Where were the immigrants coming from?
Yeah, wherever. I mean, they were,
just wherever.
Wherever, but they were slowing down the boats and they would just kick the people off before, you would think, a normal person would throw the alcohol over and save the people. But Joe, that just spoke to his character. So he liked to tell that story.
Oh my God.
And so he never liked Joe Kennedy because he thought he was a man of low character.
Yeah, I'd say that's pretty low character there.
Right, yeah.
Just like dumping people.
Instead, right. And, apparently he was ruthless and,
Holy shit.
He didn't like. I mean, he did business with him because they had mutual interests, but he didn't like him personally. He didn't like his character.
Wow. So, but either way, Joe was ingrained with all the different families from those years. Like he knew all the guys.
Oh, right. I mean, they were basically did in the same business, except for they had the rights to all the the Irish whiskey and and the Scotch from
Is that usually from Canada when they were doing it at the time? Prohibition?
Right.
Okay.
Bringing in, the whiskey and stuff from Ireland, went to Canada and then down in the United States through the Hudson River Valley. And, that's why there's all kinds of Sicilians and Italians all up through there.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
So your grandfather didn't like him, but either way, through Joe's connects, he goes to the mob and says, my son would like to be president. Right. How do we make that happen? So what did they do to get, I feel like a lot of people don't know this history and they should. What did they do to get Kennedy into office?
Well, of course, the mob had a lot of influence in a lot of the unions, specifically, the Teamsters Union with Hoffa. And, they basically said, hey, we want to get this guy in. And, they went to their membership and, the membership basically helped him get elected. And they felt that they were, they were key. They being, my grandfather and the mafia felt like, they did the right thing. They helped him get elected. And in exchange, I guess the understanding was that they would, kind of look the other way or, there would be some upside for them helping to get the Kennedys into office.
It would take some of that public heat they're seeing with Apalachin.
Right, off.
Right.
That was in theory, but as we know, especially Robert and John, they went after the mob, right? They felt like that was one of the biggest scourges in the country at the time, and they were going to put an end to it. Knowing what their father did, who knows if they really knew, what the father. I have to think they did.
They had to know,
right? You had to know, but I don't think we will never know for sure, but.
Because he didn't win that election. He didn't
like
between
you said, right?
You mentioned the unions 100%, and then the other thing is like if people go look at the map, I guess like the electoral map of 1960 of Kennedy Nixon, he won by razor thin margins in Illinois and Texas in particularly, and like there was the known fact that like the mob was having dead people vote in Chicago and in Dallas and stuff like that. And they put him into office. And then, like you said, he makes his younger brother the AG. And I mean, Bobby Kennedy took this Apalachin thing and made that look like a Swedish massage. I mean, he put all these guys in front of the camera. So, it was nuts. And so the big conspiracy that everyone always thinks about, because clearly there was shit done, is Kennedy getting murdered in Dallas in November 1963. And I've been comfortable with it for a long time with the fact that the mafia was involved in that. Right. But how much, I assume you never talked about that with your grandfather, but like, I don't know if you talked with your dad about it. Like how much information did you ever get on that growing up?
Yeah, I mean, the story, the line my dad used all the time was, it's not a question of whether there was a second gun, it's who has it now. And he had claimed that when he was he was doing time in Terminal Island, and the shooter, I don't recall the name. I wish I would have remembered, the name the guy told me. My dad did say that when he was telling me the story, he told me the guy's name. I just don't remember it. But, he claimed that this guy said, yeah, he was in the grate under the grassy knoll, took his shots, walked out, got into a car and took off. So, it's hearsay. I've heard a guy told my dad this, but I had no reason to not believe my dad. And I don't think my dad would have any reason to, make up a story.
I bet he's not making it up.
But I mean, that's what he believed. What I'm trying to say is I'm confident that's my dad believed that's what happened. And I tend to believe that my dad was telling me, he believed that for a reason and he had, some inside information. So I believe that's the way it went down. I know in high school we did this whole thing about, the lone gunman theory and trying to, figure out how they could make that many shots in that small of an area in that amount of time.
Not
and it was
possible.
just the physics alone, there had to be something else. And, there was something else. So, we will never know the truth, right. But, that's the story that I was told.
Devil's advocate, even if the guy telling that to your dad was full of shit and just looking for attention, either way, the evidence around it to show the involvement of, to name a few names here, the mafia for sure, Cuban elements, and at least some members of the CIA in the middle of that is, I use the word irrefutable. Just starting with Jack Ruby alone, who was a known associate, the whole bit, like, oh, why is he there to make him shut up? And the guy had cancer too. It's like he was on his way out. Right. It was too perfect how they did this. So it's not a matter of like, to me, did they? It's a matter of, well, all right, maybe that guy was telling the truth. Maybe he told your dad the right story and he was down there, or his friend was down there and he took credit. But there was someone down there, and I'll bet it wouldn't have been, to me, it wouldn't have been someone that they could have tied in any sort of like governmental or official capacity way to the CIA. It would have had to be some sort of criminal element, in the same way that like Lee Harvey Oswald was like a communist sympathizer or something like that. Like they'd have to make that tie up. So it only makes sense to me that the likely outcome was that the shooter was either a Cuban or someone from the mafia.
Right.
Period.
It's just easier to believe. It seemed like a hit. right? It didn't, you know, it didn't seem like some lone nut just decided to take some pot shots at the president. No, there's definitely seemed like that was a hit. Somebody double crossed, and there's the story. There's where the double cross happened, and that was the price you paid. And going back to my, previous comment, nobody who ever got whacked by the mafia didn't know it was coming. So I would put that in that category because they had to know, Bobby and JFK, that when they decided to go against the mafia, that they were not just going to let it happen. I mean, it's not the nature of that beast.
I'll bet they did it. You're right. So, like knowing what we know, you're right. Yeah. But I'll bet they didn't because they were so separated from reality.
Right.
Especially
they were Kennedys.
Yeah, they're Kennedys. They're the fucking president and the AG. They're like,
no way, they can't touch us. Right.
But and they didn't do it alone. Like in their, I guess, like defense. Like this wasn't like just the mafia. Like, all right, whack them. It's like, all right, we're dealing with so and so at the CIA or whatever. Okay,
right. There was a lot of interests that were satisfied. They didn't shed a tear when he got shot. So
yeah, that's a wild part of history, and there's a reason. Everyone wants them to release those documents, and like selfishly, like I want that too. But if those documents show what we know it's going to show, which is that there were some people involved with the government, even if they were rogue, right? They're involved with the government right. who were involved. That's going to destroy, even though it's 60 years ago.
Right.
Like the CIA they're going to have riots outside that place. Like they can't, you know what I mean? Like
right, they can't let that information out.
They need to leave out that 0.01% chance. Because once it becomes 100, they're fucked.
Absolutely.
But it's just crazy that the mafia was in the middle. And I think like I might be remembering this wrong, but like Kennedy, who was a coos hound, he was also wasn't he like with Phyllis McGuire or something? And then Sam I might be remembering this wrong, but like right. Sam Giancana, the Chicago boss, was also with her at the same time. So there was like some sort of jealousy there.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I don't know the details of that story, but I've heard that story as well.
I would totally buy that.
Yeah. So
there's always some sort of right. There's a woman involved somehow. Always is. But this is during that time, so they had all the heat on him because it did still happen. RFK was the AG. He brought these guys in front of the camera and everything. And now we get into the 60s, and this is what you were alluding to a lot earlier in our conversation with the whole Pax Bonanno ending.
Right.
So you had mentioned your grandfather got like abducted in air quotes and all that.
Right.
So what happened? Like what led up to that? The Bonannos and the five families are floating along. Everything's good. And then all of a sudden your grandfather has enemies. Like what went down?
Well, in short, they, the repercussions of the Gallo and the Profaci, the battle that they were having internally, after Joe Profaci died, Joe Malioco took over, and he wanted to settle the scores or even the score, however you want to put that, with Gallo. And
can you explain who Joe Gallo was to people?
Well, Joe Gallo is Crazy Joe Gallo was his name, and he was kind of a low level leader that wanted more and felt like he deserved more. And in the 50s, he tried to become the boss of his family, but then he ended up getting arrested and going to jail for like 10 years. But during the time he was incarcerated, all he did was plan, his revenge. And then when he got out, he went after, at that time it was the head of the family was, Colombo was the head of the, became the Colombo family at that point. And he took him out, he had him taken out. While he was giving his speech, it's in the well documented in the Godfather movie and in The Offer. They have a whole scene that depicts that. But that was Joey Gallo who caused all that strife in the Profaci family.
Which had become the Colombo family.
Which had become the Colombo family, right.
Which actually, because you mentioned, we've talked about Magliocco a bunch today, because he was your grandfather's cousin, right?
He was Joe Profaci's cousin, and Joe Profaci being the head of the Profaci clan, and they became well, my father married my mother, who was a Profaci, who was Joe Profaci's niece. His brother Salvatore was my grandfather, my mother's father. But Malioco took over after Joe died,
early 60s.
in the early 60s until, and then Colombo took over. And I should know that history better.
So he wasn't related to your grandfather. He was related. He was on your mom's.
On the Profaci side, yeah.
Got it. Okay. So he takes over, and there's beef with your grandfather.
No, they were still dealing with their internal strife. However, there's this. It's not clear to me how exactly what happened, but they went to a meeting. Back in the 70s, they made a movie called Honor Thy Father. It was a book written by Gay Talese, and then it was made into a movie. But the scene, shows that they went to a meeting, and Joe Malioco went to a meeting with the Gallos, and my dad was, happened to drive, was at the house because, my mom was living there, and Joe Malioco had a nice house, and, we had come out to New York and we were living there. So my mom was there. And of course, my dad was visiting with my mom. The story goes that he took Joe to this, Joe Malioco to this meeting. The people they met with said, "Hey, Bonannos are with them." He even had Joe Bonanno's son, and that's how he kind of got sucked into that whole thing. And then that's when the kind of led to the falling apart, the war, because in the factions that were created, it all kind of they went to war, and.
Got it. So hold on, let me review this so that people can follow.
Yeah, I'm confused myself.
Yeah,
there was a lot. I mean, there's a lot written about that, so I don't really know what happened. Just going from what I remember, what I've read, and what I was told. So
right. So you have a good understanding of like what was going on with the war, because like you said, you were actually unknowingly witnessing some of it when you were a kid, right? So, but before that. If I'm understanding this, Profaci dies, Malioco becomes boss and this is the Profaci family that eventually becomes the Colombo family as we know it today, which is going to happen in a few years at that point because Colombo is not boss yet. But Malioco wanted to put a hit out on I think some other bosses or something. And then what you're saying here is that the faction was Malioco and say like a crazy Joe Gallo kind of. And then on the other side were like the former Profaci loyalists. And then your dad's caught in the middle of this because your mom, who's a woman not in the mafia, but she's from the Profaci family. It's like there's a question of like allegiances there because he's married into it. Right.
And then mixed all in there was also, it was at the time when, Colombo wanted to become a member of, he wanted to be on the commission. And the story goes that he went to my grandfather and, asked him and if how he could, can you get me on the commission basically? And he said, no, that's not how it works. There's got to be an open spot, and then we'll fill it. Right. Well, the only way to make an open spot is to, take somebody out. So Colombo took what my grandfather said, interpreted it. What he said was, well, if I want to get on the commission, I need to make my own spot. So I need to hit either, Lucchese or Carlo Gambino. Where that's not what my grandfather said. And he always argued, he always felt really misunderstood because of that point. Because the rumor got out Colombo said, hey, Joe Bonanno said I should, I should hit you guys to get on the commission.
Oh, he played him on the other end.
Right. So that, that caused the strife between, Lucchese, Gambino, and my grandfather. But it wasn't true, right? He didn't say that. And then right on the heels of that, when, my dad is with, Malioco for this other meeting, it's like, they kind of cemented it. And that's when they decided to, the commission said, called my grandfather in, said, hey, explain yourself. And, there's a long history of those commission meetings turning out to be ambushes. And unless he had,
Wait, at the commission meetings?
Yeah, well, the commission, wanted to know what this beef was about because, Lucchese and Gambino said, hey, this guy's, he put a hit out on us. And, they said, hey, well, come and explain yourself. And, my grandfather wanted, the guy, Zarelli from Detroit, and I think it was Bruno from Philadelphia. You wanted the whole commission there, so he would have an equal and a fair hearing. Well, they would never bring those guys in. They said, "Oh no, we'll just handle this among the 5 families." And he didn't feel like he would get a fair trial. Plus, he was concerned that was a setup, so he never showed up in front of the commission.
Did they ever? Was there ever that we know of a hit that was done at a commission meeting?
At a commission meeting, no.
But he was worried about that happening.
He was worried about, it wasn't an official commission meeting. It was the commission was calling him in to explain himself. So it wouldn't have taken place with all the fathers around. Right. It would have been, them, coming before, well, at that point, it would be the other 4 fathers, and 2 of those being the ones that were supposedly the hit. So he didn't think he'd get a fair shake. So he never showed up. And then they took that as a slap in the face, the commission. And, that's when they, went to the basically family members, in the Bonanno family, and they caused strife, which caused the internal war, which led to my grandfather saying, I want out of this. And he proposed the terms, that, hey, look, I'll gracefully bow. I'll go out to Arizona. I'll leave all this, if we could just, call it quits. And that's, in short, I mean, it's much more involved in that, but
that's skipping ahead. So let's get into the meat and potatoes of because it's straight out of a movie, literally, like what went down in the 60s, right when this happened. So Columbo goes to the commission, and he was kind of like a snake and played the other end and said, "Ooh, he told me to kill these guys." So now they're all pissed at your grandfather. Your grandfather feels like, all right, he punched first. They're not going to believe me. We got a problem. This is where the quote unquote abduction happens, right?
Well, right, and he's also under federal indictment at the time.
What was he under federal indictment for? Like tax evasion?
Yeah, it was some white collar. Yeah, I think it was tax evasion. I'm not really 100% sure why. But they were looking for him, and he was subpoenaed, and he was supposed to appear before a judge the next day.
And he was abducted outside his lawyer's house.
Well, it was on Fifth Avenue, I believe, with his lawyer.
Right. So his lawyer was then like, hey, some guys came and said, Mr. Bonanno, we want to see you. Come with us. And they left. And so he wasn't seen. People thought he was dead because he wasn't seen for 2 years.
Almost 2 years, right. Excuse me.
Did you ever find out where he went for those 2 years?
Well, he talks about it once again in his book, where he went out to Arizona, he went to El Paso, he was in New York, he was all over during that time, but he spent most of that time in Tucson.
He didn't leave the country at any point.
Not during that time, no.
But no one could find him.
Well, yeah, I don't know. Maybe when he was in Buffalo, they went to Montreal. I don't know, in Canada, but they didn't go to Sicily or anywhere else during that time.
And so he then just shows up one day in court and says, like, I understand you want to speak with me, and he's back. Right. So this is 2 years later. During that time, though, it sounds like you mentioned that they went and caused the commission and people around it, Columbo, guys like that, they went in and caused internal strife in the family, saying like, ooh, your boss is, the emperor has no clothes because he tried to do this.
When my dad left, when my grandfather left, that's when Dad stepped in, right? Not everybody was happy that my dad was, the consigliere, and he was number 2, right? There were a couple guys, Gaspar di Gregorio and others that, felt that, this young kid, he was 26 years old, 25 years old, and he's coming in, and he's going to, he just gets to, skip the line and go to the number 2. But my grandpa, trusted him. And, when things got really hairy, that's when my grandfather decided to come back because, what happened with Malioco and, my dad being with him, and, Grandpa felt it was time to come back.
What happened with Malioco?
Well, that's when he went to this meeting, and they were talking about, whatever their hit was or whatever their beef was. And my dad was with Malioco. So they interpreted that as, well, it's, the Profacis and the Bonannos are together on this. And,
Got it. And they took away power from Malioco, and someone else, like Malioco was another one they basically like retired, kind of.
Heart attack. He died as
he died.
Right. And then that's when,
Okay.
and then, then Colombo took over for a while. And then, of course, then he was shot.
Right. We touched that at least with the crazy Joe Gallo thing. Okay. We'll get up to that too. But your grandfather comes back, 66. Your dad has been in charge during this time, but there's not full support as you laid out because they look at it as some nepotism. He's young. He also had been schooled out in California, so he didn't grow up there the entire time. They didn't like that. But he's in charge. Grandpa comes back. Well, he's the boss. Now there's the quote-unquote bananas war that you were witnessing in your basement, where, roughly speaking, half the family was like, yeah, we're loyal to Joe, and half the family was like, we need new blood.
Right.
And so there was plenty of bloodshed during this time. It was not good. You've made it sound like, and I think your grandfather did too, like wrote about it and spoke about it on 60 Minutes, but like he was kind of like, I'm getting too old for this shit, I'm done. And they just agreed to it. They're like, yeah, you can leave New York and retire and we're not going to touch you.
In short, yeah. I mean, he arranged it. So to appease them, he said, you can put your guys in power, in my family. I'm just, I'm going to pull out. I won't have, I have no ties. I won't have any pull back here. I'm just going to go. And, they agreed to that, and he did that.
Did he ever like wonder why they agreed to that?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I know he has, he put him in a position because he was, pretty shrewd like that, where that was in their best interest. And that's why they went with it. Now, I don't recall the exact details of that, but it was a way. And I wish I could recall exactly, how he couched it. My grandfather, he basically set it up, gave them what they wanted while he got what he wanted. It was a win-win, and they went for it.
No, your dad, he was older, but your dad is a young man at this time who had just been like in charge, and he's got to go out with him and retire as well. Did he? I mean, he was cool with. It's not like it was his call, I guess, but he was cool with that. Just like, all right, I'm gonna leave all this behind.
Yeah, I mean, he was loyal to my grandfather, and he knew that's what my grandfather wanted. So, he was going to go along with that. Yeah, I'm sure as a young man with his own, desires and designs on, on his life, maybe he would have, liked to stay there. But, he got ambushed on Troutman Street in Brooklyn.
Yeah, what happened there?
They called a meeting. He showed up for the meeting. On his way into the meeting, they started shooting at him, and that's really that's one of the things that brought Grandpa back, out of his hiding or his abduction, was that once they started shooting at my dad, he felt he had to get back in there and try to calm things down.
Also, a little tie to the Godfather there, but your dad lived. Like the Don came back in when Sonny got hit, and he's like, "All right,
I'm coming back.
We're out of bed now."
Right. So.
That's crazy.
Art imitating life and life imitating art, however you want to look at it.
Yeah, and we had touched very early on about the parallel where your parents' wedding is the basis of the entire first scene of The Godfather, because, your grandfather was such a powerful guy who was one of the dudes they modeled Vito Corleone after in the movie. But also, and you've alluded to it, your mom she was the niece of Joe Profaci, who was the head of the Profaci family. So she had grown up around it, but she didn't. You and I were talking in the car before. They hid that from her, like she really didn't know much about it.
Right. She was raised in a boarding school or a convent, and even when there were articles in the paper, she recalls as a kid, looking at the paper and they were just cut out. Certain articles just cut out, and it was. Pretty normal. So it wasn't, it's like, show me what this article was. She just, figured it was a picture or something that, her parents didn't want her to see. And you just went on about things
But then when she's an adult, she knows your father's in it.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, she's not, she wasn't completely obtuse, but, yeah, she wanted no part of it. Didn't understand it. Didn't like all the stress that he was under. Didn't like paying the lawyers all the money they paid the lawyers. Her line was, well, the lawyers' kids have new shoes. Because, it was kind of tough for her when people were incarcerated. There's not like there's a Social Security fund for mobsters, right? When they're not earning, when they're not out on the street earning, there's no income, right?
No.
We had uncles and my grandmother lived there, and my Uncle Greg was really good to my mom and helped out, but it wasn't like there was a central bank the Mafia Bank of America sending a monthly stipend to support my mom and the kids while Dad was away. That didn't happen like that. Now, if a soldier died in service, the Don would take care of that family, but when you're up in the upper echelon like my dad was, they were.
If it gets turned off, it's turned off.
That's it, right?
It.
There was no reserve or no backup plan. It was he was out making money or he wasn't.
And your mom's still alive today too.
My mom is still
doing
alive.
well in Arizona.
Yeah.
So does she ever? At her wedding, she's got, as you said, senators, congressmen, judges, mob bosses, all these people. Tony Bennett singing there. The cake that's 12 stories tall, and then it becomes the basis of the first scene in the most famous movie ever made. Does she ever reflect on that now? Wow, that shit was wild.
She doesn't. If she does, she doesn't talk about it. She was whatever, 19, 20 years old. She was just a kid herself. And back then, the important families in Brooklyn would have those kind of, maybe not as lavish as the wedding my parents had, but they would be big weddings attended by a lot of people. And so it wasn't that abnormal, right? It was just a little bit bigger than everybody else's. And she knew, they were, the Bonanno family, they were special. And, her uncle was, a man, a respected man. So they knew they were special in some, whatever, in their little society. But, no, I don't think she ever, reflects about, her role in any of, the movie and all that. She was just kind of, she was definitely there and definitely a key piece of it and has a great story. But
crazy story.
Yeah, I don't think she, she sits around and waxes about that.
What is how did your parents meet though? Just running in the same circles when they were kids?
They were families. My grandfather Salvatore Profaci and my grandfather Joe Bonanno were friends. They were buddies. They were both smart guys, and they liked each other, right? So they would, families would visit families. They were, close. They were Sicilians, and my mom knew my dad from when she was, 8 or 10 years old, and he was a few years older, and always had a crush on him. And the story is that it was an arranged marriage. Grandpa denies that. Everybody, my dad denied it, mom denied it, but mom fell in love with dad. Was in love with dad at a young age. It was a family friend, and fortunately for both of them, it worked out.
Yeah, all things considered.
That mom really just fell in love with him, and they ended up getting married, and the rest is history.
And he didn't die in the war and all this, right? Things turned out okay. Right. It could have gone bad, but you to go back forward with it, you talk about your grandpa coming back, and then this war happens, and then you allude to him having the proper leverage, let's say, to be able to pull off that deal to go out west. But now you're growing up in Arizona. When did you start asking questions or wondering okay, my family seems to be a little different here. What's the real basis of what we do?
Well, growing up, I kind of had a chip on my shoulder because, dad wasn't around all the time. I would go to the father-sons, games and things with my neighbor's dad, which, I was very appreciative that he took me. But it's still, I'd go with my older brother, everybody else was, had their dad there. At even high school graduation, dad was there. So I was kind of had a chip on my shoulder, kind of ignored it all and just wanted to, distance myself from it. But as I got older, it became harder because, people had, they believe certain things, right? And it doesn't matter what the truth is. They know your name, they know who your family is, and they automatically, prejudge you. And at some point, you realize you can't fight it.
Yeah.
You might as well embrace it and try to make the most out of it. And that's what happened. And it wasn't really until college that I realized, it was kind of extraordinary because you hear about other kids, upbringings, and I would tell stories and they would go, "Wow, really? Wow, that really happened." And that's when you realize
you didn't have guys sleeping in your basement.
That's not the way it was for you. And and then you realize when you start getting older and you see other people's lives and how other people were brought up that and of course you're a little smarter, better read, and you figure it out. Oh yeah, this was something special.
Yeah.
But it still feels like it was our normal. Right.
Yeah.
So
crazy normal.
Right.
But
I don't know anything else. Right?
Yeah.
So,
but it's like, it is, as we've been saying this whole time, it's like a piece of American history, for better or worse, like in general. And your family was at the ground floor of it, hypothetically.
Right. And the name persists for whatever reason.
Yeah. I don't know why.
I don't know why they never. They've changed, like you said, they've changed the names of the other families. But the Bonanno family has always been one of the 5 original commission families, and the name still sticks.
And you've, I think you said this at some point early on when we were talking about it, but you had mentioned your grandfather was against prostitution, didn't get involved in that business, and he was also, as were some of the other bosses early on, very against narcotics.
Right.
Because he didn't like anyone not having a clear head, like in general, so he didn't want to be a part of that business that led to people not having that. But the problem is narcotics are a huge moneymaker. So as the years go on, you have younger soldiers coming up, especially people who are not immigrants, they're first, second generation. They're looking at this and they're like, how the fuck are we not getting involved in this business? And there's a lot of, when you look at some of the, let's say, like the people who over the years were investigating your grandfather or things like that and your father, they would always claim like, oh no, they were absolutely involved in narcotics. But your father and grandfather maintained that they were nowhere near it. And they admit that right when they left the Bonanno family, and it was no longer theirs, they went out to Arizona, the Bonannos had broke free and they were crazy into narcotics and everything. But is that, do you believe them on that they legitimately, kind of like Don Corleone in the movie, were like, no, we want no part of this and you're going to get killed if you get involved with it?
Yeah, well, I don't know if there was any you're going to get killed if you get involved with it, but it wasn't something that he tolerated. Yeah, if he knew about it, there would be repercussions. Now, dealing some drugs is not, may not be a capital offense. So I don't know if he would, kill him. There's only certain things you do that, got you whacked. And I don't think, unless, the grandpa told you specifically don't do this and you did it anyway. But if they just say, well, we're frowning upon this and then you do it, well, maybe that's not a capital offense. But that's not the point. The point was that, grandpa maintained the whole time that he was, against narcotics and the whole narcotics trade. And I think he saw what would happen with all the money, and because it kind of happened exactly what he always said, that if all this money comes in and it's easy money, and narcotics is big money and it's easy money for them, that why would they need to follow this code or listen to your boss and pay deference to the to the family, to the father of the family? Why would you put up with all that stuff when you can go make your own, quick million, selling some heroin? And that's exactly what happened. All these guys, started doing their own thing, and it kind of fell apart.
It's amazing that he was able to be in control for so long and have the ability to recruit and have a big family for a long time, because even from day one, a guy like Lucky Luciano was always involved in that business.
Right.
So you look at a bunch of these other families, there was always elements of it, even if there were some bosses who were like, oh no, we're not really into that. They weren't as strong about as your grandfather was on it. But the competitive disadvantage, recruiting family members when you don't offer that, you better be able to make money like crazy hand over fist and gambling and stuff like that, I got to think. No?
Well, yeah, I mean, and they were more, the legitimate businesses were just as important, right?
What were their legitimate businesses?
Cheese,
Of course.
and they were big into the garment business. They had trucking companies, warehousing. So he would always find partners that knew their business real well, that needed, and a lot of people came to him. Right. They knew he was a, well-to-do guy. He had influence. They would have a good idea for a company and they would approach him. And, he definitely wanted to, be in legitimate businesses, because the dream was always to, to get out and fall back on those. So
for your grandfather,
for my grandfather. Yeah. He definitely, saw that he was going to get out at one point, and, wanted to have land holdings. And, I think his real love was his cheese business. I mean, he just had his whole personality changed when he started talking about cheese. And, there's a great, the state of Pennsylvania had this whole investigation. They call it the mozzarella. They cornered the market with the mozzarella. So pretty much anybody who was making a pizza in America in the 70s, the mafia was getting some of that action
for a couple reasons there, but yeah,
right. But if you ever look that up, the state of Pennsylvania, I think it was like 1983 or so, they did a whole investigation, and my grandfather, that talks about the whole cheese business and how they, made people use their cheese, and and it's that's a good story. It's another tangent.
So but it's interesting to me that he always wanted that as a fallback. I wouldn't have expected that from your grandpa, because it seemed like the way you were explaining it was he viewed that as the next generation, and this is just the life he had to have. But either way, it's interesting that he obviously made a fuck ton of money for those 30 years when things were good.
Yeah.
And when shit hit the fan, he didn't give it up right away. He still came back. He still fought for it. It's kind of like, I'm looking at it psychologically, and I'm thinking to myself, it's like once you're in, you do like the action. Like you even if he had always said to himself, like, oh, I want to just be able to go to the legitimate businesses. It's like you enjoy a level of power and operating outside the law when you do something like being the boss of a family, that it's like once it comes time to give it up, it's like, oh, I'll stay a couple more years. I can do another 5. And then eventually it turns into a spot where it's like, no, he literally had to be like, all right, I need to get out of here. It took that to get there, is my point.
Right. And that is one of the criticisms that people have, of his book, that he doesn't, doesn't ever speak to that side of it. Right. He's always talking about the structure of the family and how that was all important to him. But yeah, you must, there had to be motivations, like you said, just the way humans are, that, you like to be boss. It's good. Yeah. It's good to be king, type of thing.
It is.
Right. So yeah, I'm sure there was, I'm not privy to that. I don't know what was in his mind, but I do know that, he wanted to, he wanted to have legitimate businesses, and he wanted to be a legitimate businessman. He was. There was a lot of, guys that were, part of the mafia, or whatever you want to call it, part of the family, that were, shoemakers and, pipe fitters, and but they were guys that understood the tradition, and they may have needed a favor or something. And it was all about connections, really, right? If you know somebody and that could help me out, and I know somebody that you need something and he provides that service, they'll put them together. And that was really the structure that, that grandpa liked. Having, sometimes, they had to go outside the law to do the things, but I think he would have preferred, if he didn't have to, if he could do everything legitimate, he probably would have been, happier with that, I think.
Is that what he leaned, like when he went out to Arizona, because he ended up living another 30 some years. Yeah. Did he still had his legitimate businesses, some of them at least, right?
Right. But at that time they were going after my grandfather and my dad and my Uncle Joe. They were getting indicted, it seemed like, every week. And then there was that whole commission thing. And
what whole commission?
The commission trials, right? Where they brought my in
the 80s.
And that was in the 80s.
Right. But when he first goes out there in the 70s, does he still have like the cheese business and everything?
Yeah. But they were all under indictment all through the 70s, right? They were fighting the government, and all the money they sold everything to pay the lawyers to fight the government because he did not want to lose that. And he felt he was in the right, that they were coming, they were coming after him. Well, my dad and my uncle, only because they were his sons.
Right.
And they were, he was going to pay any amount of money to defend them. And he did. I mean, they sold all the land, they sold the businesses, basically to fight the government, because that became his mission.
Fighting the government.
Fighting the government, right? He felt that they were the Gestapo. He would refer to the government as the Gestapo, and he couldn't believe that they would do the things. Can't even imagine how he would feel now that the Justice Department is basically weaponized, and that's what he was afraid of. And he would speak to that all the time, and it's weird because I remember hearing that long, long time ago, and then here we are.
Yeah, I think over history, like if you look at it, we didn't have the benefit, or they didn't have the benefit, I should say, of 50 years ago having like social media and things like that, the internet with ubiquitous information. But, you can run through it, even in a country like this, which is a great example to the world. There has always been, politics is just a piece of it. There is corruption built into the system. Right. They are going to weaponize some of these things depending on, which of the two parties is in power. You're 100% right. But it's interesting he looks at it that way, because what I'm hearing in that is he was so set in his attitude from his own experience of, like, for example, worst case scenario, like Mussolini, of then viewing everything in the future as like, there's pieces of that. There's pieces of that here, so they must be the bad guys. It's like the cops and robbers or the cops and criminals, like, who's the cop and who's the criminal? You have a different view on it depending on what seat you're sitting in.
Well, yeah, I mean, and when you have a hammer, most everything looks like a nail, right? So that's a saying because it's true. Right? Yeah. So absolutely, I would say, he did have a prefixation on the whole fascist thing, and anything that the government did that was a little bit like that, he would consider that fascist.
Interesting. So we've been talking about it throughout the conversation about the whole book that he wrote in '83, A Man of Honor. And I think now we're like right at that point where we should really dig into that, because it became something that it wasn't ever intended to be. And this is something that still causes drama today with some guys on the internet, former mobsters, arguing about it, which we can get into. But your grandpa, who at this point is, I guess when it came out, he's like 78 years old. He's the oldest school of the oldest school. Everyone he came up with is dead at this point, right? Lucky Luciano's dead, Al Capone's dead, all these guys. And he decides to write this book called A Man of Honor. In it, he doesn't name names. He doesn't mention anyone who's alive now and what's going on. He gives some generalized opinions. And so he felt he had kept the code of silence, omerta, with the book. But he does talk about some of the process and explains that, confirms that the world exists. Did he envision that just mentioning the structure of everything would be used against the current mafia in court?
Did he envision? I don't think so. I mean, he had a lot of foresight, but I don't think there was any way he could have, predicted that that's what would happen. I mean, he wanted to tell his story. He wanted to, set the record straight from his point of view, because he felt that, it really comes back to this boss of bosses thing, that he didn't want to be the boss of bosses, and that's contrary, to what he was all about. And he wanted to get the message out that wasn't him, that wasn't what he was about. So that was really the point of it. He waited until he was that old because, he didn't want to break the code. And anybody that he talked about or, implicated in that book was dead and gone. So there was really no violation of any code. And, he wasn't selling anybody out, because that's, omerta is keeping quiet, but it's, you don't narg out your brothers. You don't, you just don't do that. And he didn't feel like he was doing that because they were all gone. There was no way he could have predicted that, a few years later, Giuliani would, use that as the basis to say, hey, this was a racket. This was the commission. They were colluding, and here's how it worked. Yeah, in his book, he does outline how the structure of it and the function, and how it functioned, how it was structured. So he definitely teed it up for him, but I don't there was no intent to do that, and there was no way he could have known.
Because the other thing, just for historical timeline perspective for people out there like trying to follow it, it's like RICO wasn't used, I don't believe, until that commission trial you talked about in 85 or 86.
Right.
So this was invented throughout the 70s into the 80s by G. Robert Blakey, that then allowed for the first time the government to make a case where they could take a lower level or a lower level soldier's offense and just use it as reasonable proof, let's say, that none of that action could happen without the people all the way up here. Right. In essence, like the bosses that your grandfather was writing about.
Right.
So then Giuliani sees his book, doesn't like your grandpa, obviously, because he was in the mob, and then decides like, oh, I'm going to now compel this guy to testify at these trials about what he wrote here. Right. And your grandpa wouldn't do it.
Correct. Yeah, he went in front of the judge and he said, no, I'm taking the fifth. We're going to hold you in contempt of court. Asked him again. He said, no, I'm taking the fifth. They put him in for 6 months. 6 months later, judge asks him the same question. He gives the same answer. Happened again. After 18 months, the judge says, this guy's not going to talk. He's costing us too much money to keep him here. Because they had special details watching him, and, he had health issues, and they basically sent him home.
And that was it.
That was that for him, right?
Yeah.
For the other guys, but who got busted on the commission trials. I mean, they were fixing contracts. I mean, and they got caught talking about it. So yeah, you can say, oh well, it's because Joe Bonanno's book, right?
No, he didn't testify.
He didn't testify, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah, the book was there, and it was the basis for the prosecution. Using, showing that there was racketeering going on, that, like you said, there's no lower level thing could go on because the bosses had to prove it. And that, shows that there was a criminal organization, there was racketeering going on, and he was successful in that prosecution. But those guys didn't help themselves by,
they were on wires.
Yeah, right. Being recorded, talking, exactly how they were fixing the contracts for the cement contracts in New York City. So I don't know. I just if somebody thinks he did it on purpose, and people do. I mean, people have been saying that he did this on purpose, kind of to get back at people. It's not the case. It's absolutely not the case. He wanted to say his piece from his perspective, and he wanted people to know what really happened, and that's why he wrote the book.
Yeah, I mean, one of the more shocking things that I think probably was part of the reason those claims fly around is because beyond the book, he actually did like the 60 Minutes interview where you put a face on it. You hear the man talk. It was like a full half-hour, 40-minute segment or whatever, which is available on YouTube. But just for people right now, I wanted to play. I have it behind us right there. I wanted to play a quick segment of this because he's talking about the idea of it, and just putting myself in that time period, 1983, this is where it's still a mystique. Like at this point, at least the Godfather's out. There were those early like hearings or whatever, but people are wondering like, well, how deep does this stuff go? And then you literally have like a piece of history here, like an 80-year-old man saying, I'll tell you all about it or whatever.
Here's how it goes.
All right, so let's see. I think I have it on that one part we were talking about earlier. Let's see if it is.
In Maranzano, you loved a man, you said, by the name of Salvatore Maranzano.
Yes.
Your first hero.
That's right.
Was Salvatore
Maranzano.
Yes. But then you say he was said to be able to snap a man's neck with his fingers. And I say when I read that...
That's a metaphorical.
Well, it's quite a metaphor.
Well,
it's quite a metaphor. He also told you this.
Wait, I got to pull that back one sec. This line.
You like that line.
But then you say he was said to be able to snap a man's neck with his fingers. And I say when I read that.
That's a metaphorical.
That's a metaphorical.
Well, it's quite a metaphor. It's quite a metaphor. He also told you this. Man is the hardest animal to kill. When you aim at a man, your hands shake, your eyes twitch, your heart flutters. But you kill nonetheless. That's what I find a little difficult to understand.
You gotta make sure fighting for your life and to protect your life, and nobody has the right to destroy another human being. Or you don't do, but once you do, make sure. And make sure that you protect yourself with anything.
So that I can fully understand what your dad's saying.
Oh, your dad's in this, right?
Yeah,
There comes point in the affairs of men where you try to control by force. And if that does not succeed, then you have to control by being a brute.
By?
Being a brute.
And if possible, Maranzano told you, if possible, always touch the body with your gun to make sure the man is dead.
Once you fight to survive and to protect your life, make sure that you succeed.
But Maranzano himself.
That's an incredible line. So, yeah, and people, I would recommend people watch that. The reason I like playing that one is not just because it's kind of funny, like when he like is saying the full
Metaphorical,
words
right.
with the great accent and everything, but it's also like, you know, people are, someone sitting at home on a Sunday night, like listening to this guy be like, yeah, you know, sometimes it comes to that. You know, and you got to like swallow that, and then I can just imagine these mobsters who are going on trial, like, oh, this is going to sound great at trial.
This doesn't help our cause,
No,
for sure. Right?
no. So there is a little bit of animosity there, but again, like he didn't do this. Isn't being recorded when Rico was a known thing yet, and then once it did come up, he wouldn't testify about it. So hypothetically, he was like I guess like in their world a stand-up guy in that way. Still,
Absolutely. I mean, that's and that's the way he saw it. That's the way I see it. Yeah, he definitely wrote the book, but you know, he did not testify. He did not help, you know, the government's case with his testimony at all. I mean, he went to jail for it for 18 months.
yeah.
So
As an old man, too.
man, yeah.
And he had never been. They had never got him for anything in his life.
Right. He'd been arrested and he'd been incarcerated after arrest, but was never convicted until that.
And that wasn't even a conviction. It was just like,
right. That was contempt of court.
That's pretty wild that he lived to like 97, invented the commission, and never did a day in convicted jail.
Right.
Right.
Prison. Right.
That's nuts. Different world, I guess.
Yeah.
But when that trial went down in New York, wasn't it that like Giuliani, he also like refused to meet with him because Giuliani was like coming out to sit with him,
Right. Well,
as
he had a heart attack.
Your grandfather.
My
did.
grandfather, and he didn't. You know, they didn't feel like it was safe for him to travel, so they did the hearings in federal courthouse in Tucson.
And that's where he officially said I plead the fifth.
Right.
So it was all in court. Got it. It's just crazy to me that how fast that happened, because they went all these years, 50, 60 years unabated, and then suddenly government has this one law and they can tie it all together, and they literally did. I mean, they decapitated the crazy power of the mafia in
Right.
effectively like 15 years or so.
It was a crippling blow. Absolutely, the RICO laws worked.
Yeah. And before that, though, in the 70s, after you guys were gone, that was when Operation Donnie Brasco happened.
Right.
Which was, again, it's not your grandfather's family anymore, but it was in the Bonanno family.
The Bonanno family, right, with the capital F, right.
Exactly. Did he ever comment on that, like have an opinion on that, or did your dad have any opinion on like what went down there?
Well, you know, I think it was somewhat of a source of embarrassment, right, because it was so widely known. And, you know, the movie, and, you know, everybody knows Donnie Brasco and
Right.
and knows that the family that he, quote, fooled was the Bonanno family. So, but not having involved their, you know, personal involvement, either my grandfather or my dad, no, they pretty much left that alone. They weren't happy about it for sure, but they also felt, you know, didn't take responsibility for it because they were
they
were not involved at that point.
Right.
So,
but they also, when they made this deal to go out there, did they ever did your dad ever set foot in New York again?
oh yeah, and
was?
it's not a matter of not being able to go back there and do family things or regular things. It was just didn't get involved in in the activities of the mob anymore, and they didn't. Right, they did their own things, in New York. I mean, in California and in Arizona, but nothing involved with anything in Arizona after the '60s.
Interesting. Okay, so because we think of it as so these guys are so black and white about stuff. It's like you go into retirement. It's like, no, you literally can't come in the neighborhood again because that'll threaten our territory. But I guess it wasn't quite like that. They were able to do it.
Right, just didn't get involved in, but they knew they had, legitimate business dealings and other things they had to do in New York. So yeah, you can go freely, come and go freely as you want. You just, wasn't going to get involved in anything.
Right. I actually, when I was doing, I don't know if I said this on camera, but you and I had been talking before about how when I was in high school, I had to write, I was assigned to the term paper, the research paper junior year, and I had to write it on the Sicilian Mafia, over there, which then, the research ties in to what happened here. And I went down that whole rabbit hole. And this is somewhat earlier days of YouTube. So there were all these re-uploaded documentaries at the time, many of which aren't
still
on
there.
Some of them are,
yeah.
but a lot of them aren't. And I would just sit there in my free periods and watch them. And they were all produced in probably the late 90s kind of deal. And your dad he was in all of them. He was the one guy, formerly, they'd have some special ones where there'd be a former guy who ratted in court or something. Sometimes they'd hide his face and he'd be interviewed for one of these episodes in these series on A&E or whatever. But your dad was the one guy who's next to all the reporters where they're cutting back to him all the time, giving opinions on this stuff. Did he ever get any shit, even though it's years later, did he get any shit from them for talking on these documentaries about this stuff?
No, because he wasn't naming names. He wasn't giving anything away, and they all knew that that was Dad's kind of profession, was to make these movies. And he was on Discovery and 60 Minutes, and he was doing all those things because he was trying to get books and movies made, which he did. They had he ended up getting a Showtime series made about. It's kind of a blend between his story and Grandpa's story, and they had a mini book. My mom's book had a book written and then a movie made about that. So
your mom wrote a book too.
My mom wrote a book, Mafia Marriage, and
really
became a movie, and they had some success with those things, but over the years. Yeah, he wrote a couple books, and in fact, he went on to write a book with Joe Pistone, who was Donnie Brasco.
Oh, yeah.
Right. So,
what was the name of that book?
It's called The Good Guys. It's an incredible story about when the Russian mob came into Brooklyn in the 70s, and each chapter alternates between the FBI telling the story and the mob. Basically, my dad telling from the mob's perspective, and Joe Pistone telling the story from the FBI perspective, but they were both looking at the same thing. I think it's a made for, a 6-part series in Netflix or one of those movies. The way the book reads, it's just a great read. It's a great story. And I've been working with, we had a screenplay written from the book, and we've been trying to get it sold, but
yeah, I'm in on that one. That sounds sick.
Yeah, so far, nobody has written a big check and said, yeah, we're going to make this movie, but it's not over yet. I think if somebody who is interested in this genre, and there are a lot of people interested in this genre, reads that book, I mean, to me, it's a no-brainer. It's absolutely a fantastic story, and just the way they did it, and the fact they have the Donnie Brasco, I mean, Joe Pistone and Bill Bonanno, who collaborated to write this, to me is fantastic in and of itself, given the history.
That's full circle right there.
Right. So yeah, we're still working on that. And, I think Joe Pistone and Leo Rossi, have their own podcast that they're working this, and I don't think they talk about a lot of things, but I'm trying to get trying to do what I can to spark some interest in taking that other project further.
Yeah. So I had mentioned to you earlier quickly that one guy I've known for a lot of years is this dude Jules Bonavolonta, who before people even start asking me, I talked to him. He does not do podcasts. Like, he's of that ilk. Like, he will not. Right. Great guy, the best guy, but like, he literally doesn't do them. He turns down all these other people inside. I respect that. But he was the guy who was a part of that squad that took down the mafia over those 20 years, and Joe Pistone was his buddy, and Jules was the handler of Joe Pistone at the FBI. So he's talked about, like, when I would ask him about the modern day mafia, he's like, I mean, it's the same shit, gambling, prostitution, drugs, whatever. He said he's like, we have a handle on the Italian-American mafia at this point. We kind of know what we're dealing with there in the modern day. The Russians, on the other hand, he said, those motherfuckers are crazy. Like, they chop bodies up and stick it in an icebox and in like a collage for people.
Well, one of the scenes in this book is they crush a guy with a hydraulic jack in a auto mechanic shop. And,
nice. Yeah,
and I can just envision that and talk about crazy. Yeah, then the mob wouldn't have ever done anything like that, but the Russians didn't hold back.
What kind of dealings did your dad have with them? Like, how well did he know where they were integrated, what they were doing, and
Well, I think they came into Brooklyn, right? And there was some turf battles.
Like what years?
This was in the 70s.
So after your dad.
So after so he witnessed all this, but he wasn't involved. It wasn't personal impact on him, but he witnessed the transition, the old neighborhoods. That's what really bothered him, was these old neighborhoods that were solidly Sicilian and Italian, had basically become, Russian.
And it's interesting too, like geopolitically, because this is a time when the Soviet Union is still going strong and everything. There's a lot of people think about the Russian mafia just going off the charts right after Soviet Union fell, but they were already. It's not like they didn't exist before, and they were already funneling some power in New York City, America, in the 70s. That's pretty wild. I don't know much about that at all. So I think that's a story people would love to see.
I agree.
Yeah. Like, have you ever seen Eastern Promises, that movie with Viggo Mortensen, where it's in London and it's the Russian mob?
No, but I'm definitely going to check it out. Yeah.
It's wild shit. Like, these guys are crazy what they do. It's like there's always going to be something worse to come. Like, when you think you see the criminal element, that it's like, oh, we got to get a handle on this. Someone comes in and they're always like, oh, even like you look at Al Qaeda, they saw ISIS and they're like, yo, listen, we're not like that.
Right. Exactly. I mean, you could see the parallels. I won't say exactly the same, but yeah.
No, it's
I could see the parallels. Absolutely.
Yeah. So I guess, like, when did that book with Pistone happen? In the 90s?
Yeah.
I can't believe that's never been sold.
Yeah.
That blows my mind.
Yeah,
the book get made.
The book did all right, but it's just been us trying to make something happening, and it hasn't happened yet. It's not over, so you might still see that on a big screen or on a miniseries somewhere before it's over. So.
Well, you guys are also all busy people. Like, none of you grew up in the mafia. Like, your brother's a pediatrician,
right?
It's a doctor. You're in the logistics. I don't know how to describe it, right? How would you describe your business?
Telecom project management is what I do. So, it's what we call now a side hustle, for sure.
Right. Yeah, and these are the kinds of things you got to be pounding the table all the time to get it through. Right. So that's tough.
And and I met a few years, about 7 or 8 years ago, I was really put an effort together. We created an LLC and we're pitching it to people, and there's just a lot of not so upstanding characters involved in the whole, Hollywood scene and getting a movie made. Just, all these people that, hey, you just give me 10,000 and I'll turn this into 100,000 for you. It's like, no, why don't you make the 100,000 and then, we'll see. I'll pay you 10,000 out of the 100 that you made. How about that? Can never get that deal. There was always, well, just give me this, give me that. Well, no, we have the story. That's what we have, right? We have the rights to the story, and we need you to, produce it and make it into a movie and get the financing. And was never able to find that benefactor to do that.
Well, now the business is also, it's still the same in those elements for sure, but there is somewhat more of an ability from what I hear now to, if you can get your hands on like a great documentary team or something like that, to that effect. I'm not even talking about a feature film right now. I'm talking about like if you just did the documentary to start, you can make that project, which is a risk, right? Putting money into that. And then if it's good, Netflix, Hulu, these different places will start being like, oh, fuck yeah, like let's bid for that. So that, we got to figure that out.
Right.
Because that could easily, I could see it starting as like a great, 6-part miniseries documentary.
Well,
and then
that's
someone making the movie. With
all this happening in the podcast sphere, whatever you want to call this, it seems like this genre is blowing up, for lack of a better term.
It is.
And that's what made me think, maybe this is something we could crowdsource, right? And fund it that way. Because there seems to be a lot of people interested in that story. And it might, it's just something that I had toyed with in my mind. I've never, actually, started a Kickstarter or anything like that, but definitely have thought about, I wonder if there'd be enough people that would, but then again, I don't know how all that, how that world works. So I need to educate myself a lot more.
Yeah. I also think like your family story, like the Bonanno story, is one that isn't, like if you look at the Lucky Lucianos and stuff like that, there's a lot of content in different verticals that involve him, or even Al Capone, who was kind of like his own kind of thing. But, the Bonanno story is so unique, and it also has so many ties to the Godfather, and it's got a full arc from immigrant all the way through, retiring out west and the book and Rico and everything. It's that, outside like the Russian angle we were just talking about, that too, I think kind of needs its own content for people to really see it, because it's a very, very compelling story.
Right. Well, it has been told though. I mean, in the 70s there was the Honor Thy Father movie, which was, pretty successful, that told the story about, the wars in the 60s and everything. And then my dad had this Showtime miniseries that, told the story, as well. So it's not that it hasn't been done before, and it's not that it, can't be updated and modernized. I'm all for that.
That's what I'm saying, because it wasn't done during any of the golden eras of like premium long form content.
Right.
Like we have now.
It's all different now. Right.
Yeah.
And this kind of platform is made for that, to me.
Yeah.
It's like everything's coming together. I'm hoping that, to put some of those pieces together.
Yeah, I mean, you remember they did like a movie, I think it was literally called Gotti in like 96 or whatever. It was.
Excuse me.
Oh, you good?
Yeah.
It was terrible. They did like a regular kind of lower budget movie with C and D list actors. But like today, they did try to do it through his son again, and that got all fucked up. But like, how do you not make a feature series on that? You know what I mean? Like a 12-part series or something.
Hey, everybody listen to this guy. He's on to something here.
I think I'm
on board with that for sure. I agree with you wholeheartedly. And I'm hoping that's where all this leads.
Yeah, yeah. So the other thing that I referred to at one point, I said we come back to, that I'm less familiar with, but maybe you can educate me on exactly what's going on, is the guy, Michael Franzese, who's an ex member of the mafia. He was a capo regime for, he wasn't Bonanno, was he?
No,
he was.
I think he was Gambino family, but I can't tell you for sure.
I want to say, I'll look it up in a minute.
Yeah.
But he was a capo regime. His father was in it, and he ended up getting caught, turned government witness, did 10 years in prison, found God, and is a content creator now, like for a while now. And he has talked about how your grandfather, like he says, oh, the guy was a legend and all this stuff, helped build this whole thing, runs through the history of it. But he's said, like, he's one of the guys who's spoken out, like, why the fuck did he write this book? And it was a huge mistake, and he ruined his legacy and all that. Is that about what it is?
Yeah. I mean, that's a pretty good encapsulation of what has happened recently. And yeah, he does have, he speaks about my grandfather in high regard up until the point where he wrote the book, and he feels like he violated the code of omerta by writing that book. And like I mentioned before, my grandfather doesn't see it that way. I don't see it that way. I know my dad didn't see it that way either. He felt like he was telling his story. He was clarifying some things that historically were attached to him that were inaccurate. And looking, to me, looking at the book in 2022 or 2021, whenever, in modern times, it's not fair to judge it from where the life was in the 80s, right?
Right.
But we're doing it anyway, and here we are because it did happen. That's a fact, right? It did happen. Juliana used that book,
Yes.
and that book outlined the structure, and it gave Juliana the idea to put it all together under RICO, and it definitely worked. I mean,
Yes.
for the government. So I can't deny that is what happened. It's when you talk about the intent, or you say, well, he wrote this book to get back at people. No, he didn't write this book to get back at anybody. He wasn't trying to throw anybody under the bus. He wanted to say his piece and be clarified, where he stood on these, things historically that were assigned to him or attributed to him that weren't true. And that's why he wrote the book. That was the motivation of the book. But you can't deny what has happened.
I just don't understand. I mean, as an outsider looking in on this, I don't really get how you can make those types of bombastic claims about something that was later used against somebody because a new law was invented, when in fact the guy saying that, and perhaps like even when Sammy the Bull has made some similar comments or along the same lines about your grandfather, it's like, but you literally, not even blaming you, but you literally were a government witness. You know what I mean? Like you broke the ultimate, quote unquote, code of it.
Hello, pot. This is the kettle calling type of thing.
Yeah,
for sure. And maybe that's just some way that they can defer from what from their background and say, hey, well, like this guy is but what about this guy? He was worse. He wrote a book. We never wrote a book. Well, I don't know. I would love the opportunity to sit down and go over it with them and see, because they sounds like, and I say they, I'm talking about Sammy the Bull and Franzese and some of these other guys seem to be pretty adamant that Grandpa's book was the tell-all book that brought him down. Well, that's not exactly the case.
It was RICO.
Right.
It was RICO. It helped them make the case, but it was RICO's the law that broke the camel's back here.
Right. But yeah, it was the intent, right? The intent, what happened. We can't deny what happened, but the intent of writing that book wasn't to throw anybody under the bus, or it was to clarify his view of it.
Yeah, and again, like, there was at least knowledge of it in pop culture through, even if it was like off and romanticized in some ways, but you had The Godfather, and you had Godfather 2. I mean, this was 72 and 74, most famous movies ever made, and it at least, even if it was different, it showed the ideas, it showed the structure. Like, people were aware of this, you know what I mean? And to say nothing of the government had been spying on this for a long time, so they really knew what it was. It's like, to me, it seems like RICO was just kind of inevitable, Right. It was going to happen at some point or another.
So, yeah, and the writing of the book definitely, helped in that, right? Can't deny, like I said, what actually transpired. It's the motivations for those that's where I have the problem with what they're saying. 'Cause they make it sound like he did it, as vengeance type of thing, where that was not what that was all about.
Did your grandfather, I assume he watched The Godfather at some point? Did he?
Yeah, I mean, it was a huge movie in the 70s, and and I'm sure he did. Never got his take on it, or what he thought about it. I thought my dad definitely liked parts of it, and used parts of it as I don't know, as a model for the movies that he made, because that became the standard. And I know growing up and on our bookshelf, we had the script of the script of the movie that was given to my dad, and they wanted him to make notes and it sat on our shelf. I wish I still had it today.
Wait. They gave the producers of the movie gave the script
to my dad, right, to have him, basically look it over for legitimacy, or and he, he had his notes in the margins, and I remember it sat on the shelf there for years. So, because I had a big, we had a big bookshelf in our house, and I know Dad would show people, oh, this is the manuscript from the, from the screenplay, and.
Did he tell you who brought that to him? Was it like Bob Evans?
I don't know who, but no, I don't know. But I do know that, Mario Puzo grew up in the neighborhood.
Yeah.
And I know my dad had relation with him of some sort, right? Knew him, maybe not friends, but acquaintances anyway.
Wow. Yeah, that series, The Offer, which I still haven't watched, which I have to watch. You saw that, you said, right? It's pretty good.
It's really good. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, the backstory behind it, I want to see like how much they got into, because whenever I would bring that up to people, they'd be like, what are you talking about? I'm like, none of this happened without the mob, like giving the okay to do a lot of it.
Right. And they do a good job in that Offer series, talking about that. And I like the series. It's just that, the only thing I didn't like about it was that in every situation, everybody took the absolutely high road, and,
what do you mean?
There's situations like, one situation where, one of the actors, inappropriately said something or touched one of the female actors, and then in the next scene they were supposed to stage a fight, but they did it for real. They beat him up. And so in those kind of things, I thought it was real good, and they did the right thing, right? The guy inappropriately touched the woman, and he got his comeuppance in the very next scene, or when at the end, I don't want to give away the ending, but the guy, he's got this secretary that's been loyal to him, the whole time, through everything, and he sets her up in a business at the end, and maybe those things really did happen. It just seems like. But in every situation, everybody did the right thing. And it just seems like, I don't know. Does Hollywood really work that way? I don't know.
So.
Right. But it made for a good story, and it was done well.
Well, they got to make themselves look okay.
Right. They all looked great. Like I said, they all took the high road in every situation.
So I don't know if this was in there because I haven't seen it, but this is a firsthand story of someone that I knew through someone way older than me. They were friends with him, but a guy who is very high up in, let's say, the production of Hollywood over the years, and he's retired now, but he was intimately involved with that whole build up and the producing the movie and all that. Like, he wasn't a producer on the movie, but he was involved with some of the behind the scenes business of getting it done. He said that there were a couple gentlemen who would show up once a week on the set, and a designated person would go hand them a little manila envelope and nod their head, right, and that was it.
Yeah, and they do show that in the offer. They do represent that well.
Glad they put that in there.
Do, absolutely.
Very historically accurate.
Absolutely.
Because there was another story that I don't know if they have this in there, but Carlo, they were filming the scene on the streets in New York of Vito Corleone, the attempted murder on him. Mm-hmm. And this was in Little Italy where they're filming it. And at the same time, this was, I believe, right after Joe Gallo did the hit on Colombo I think that was in Columbus Square. And around the corner from the film shoot they were doing of Vito Corleone, Carlo Gambino was sitting there at the coffee shop just sipping his coffee, and there was like the understanding that he had okayed
it,
that this scene would happen.
I didn't know that, so.
I don't know. Yeah. That one is like, that's been reported. That's not like urban legend, like a guy said it or something. But that's like the whole art imitating life with that is very, very unique to me. Like how that movie got made and how it almost never happened, but then it became what it became. You know.
Yeah, I mean it's the whatever you call it, it's the one, right? Yeah. Everybody refers to and loves, and people can quote almost seems like every line in that movie. Yeah. So
yeah. And did your dad like have an opinion on Goodfellas or something like that? That was like a little more just like telling a historical story, so to speak.
Yeah, those any of those other movies, he just he wasn't a big fan, because he knew, I think because he knew the true stories and he knew where they were, what they were trying to say and what they were based on. So he just watched those things differently than the rest of us, I think. I don't think he found much entertainment in them. But as far as, he was definitely, he was into making movies and he wanted to get the story and he wanted to do that. So I think he appreciated that they were, moving the genre along.
Right, and it became like the biggest thing. I mean, when you think of all-time movies, some of them right in that wheelhouse pop in your mind.
Right.
People are just so fascinated by it, So it's like, I wouldn't want to be in it, but it's interesting to look at it. Like there's some sort of element there that people can't wrap their minds around. But did your, because your grandfather was from Castellammarese del Golfo and everything, and obviously you mentioned he was there in 57, for example, when the Appalachian medium went down in America. But like, did your dad and your family go back at all too to Sicily?
Well, my dad and mom, they went also on their wedding, their honeymoon.
Oh, cool.
They went around Sicily and Italy and I think he went back, a couple times, but not any, anything significant or any long periods of time. Now and then, I think we've all, my brothers and sisters and cousins, a lot of us have gone, on vacations. Like I went on my honeymoon. I did a bike tour of Sicily. It was absolutely incredible. We had a great time. And actually, my daughter's name is Alia, and that was named after a city that we rode to the top of and got to the top of this mountain, and it was this beautiful city. And I said to my new wife at that time, "Oh, if we ever have a daughter, we should name her Alia." And then,
oh wow, that's cool.
And she found out she was pregnant. It was Alia.
That's awesome. I always tell people I was there a couple different times and spent the second time some extended time there. Sicily it's one of the most beautiful places on earth because it has across the island. You have every single type of terrain represented. You have the coastal beautiful beach towns, you have the rolling mountainous hill towns, you have the coal towns, you have the ancient ruin towns, you have even the volcano on the island. Is that Mount Etna?
Mount Etna, yeah.
Right. So you even have snow.
Right.
There,
snow
you have
peaks,
everything.
Snow-covered mountains. Absolutely.
It's amazing. It's an unbelievable place, but it's also a tragic place just because they've never had stability there. Right. It's always been conquered, which is what leads to things like the mafia,
right,
and all that.
For sure. I loved it. I thought it was tremendous. The people, but then again, they treated us with deference. When you went there, due to my grandfather, right? Yeah, the whole town came out when I went there and
really
kind of welcomed us. Absolutely, they knew we were coming, and when we got there, we had a nice reception, and it definitely, felt like I think I mentioned to you, it felt like a rock star when we were there. So.
Now, how does that work? Does your dad make a phone call before you go, or?
Absolutely.
Okay.
They had to make reservations at the hotel, and because they wanted to stay at the, there was an inn right there at the, at the port, and they wanted me and my new wife to stay at the same place that they had, back in '56. So, definitely they made a call, and they rolled out the red carpet, and I loved it.
That's pretty sick.
I could get used to living like that, right? Yeah.
That's amazing. 2 generations later and everything too. They're doing that. What an experience. But the only other thing that I have not brought up today that I got to get your thoughts on is the other main, most respected mafia art ever created in The Sopranos, which just changed TV. How, because that's the modern mafia. That's a take on what it's like today after Rico, after all this stuff. In your dad's opinion, or I guess your grandfather kind of died right after it came out, but in your dad's opinion, how accurate was that show?
It was pretty accurate. They came to Dad and got him, he consulted on a couple of the episodes.
Oh, really?
And, the wardrobes, absolutely. I think they nailed it. All those guys dressed just like the guys dressed I was really impressed with the wardrobe. And then, some of the stories, like, there's one episode where a kid's wearing a baseball hat, in a restaurant, and they make him take the baseball hat. I've been in many restaurants with my dad, and, not only did they not wear hats in a restaurant, nobody else did, and they didn't let it happen. Or there's another episode where I think the daughter's boyfriend wants to pick up a tab. And,
yeah.
Yep. And that happened too. You didn't, when my dad was at a table, he's picking up the tab. And even though people try to be nice, it was an insult to a man, to one of those guys to pick up a tab, right? Whether you can have great intentions, but just not something you did. And, I saw people get reprimanded for trying to, reach for a check when, no, it's not your place.
It's funny.
So those things were absolutely accurate.
The first time with like a really serious girlfriend in college, when I went out to dinner with her parents, that they were doctors. They weren't even in the mob or anything. But like her dad was Italian, and I was always a guy like I like to do respectful things for people when I can or whatever. But that was one thing, like when we would go somewhere, even if it was like a tab I could totally afford, I'm like, oh yeah, I can't do that. I'm gonna get the shit kicked out of me.
Right. They took it as an insult, right?
Yeah.
And you're right. That's not mafia. That's the Sicilian Italian.
Yeah.
That's the way those guys are, for sure.
100%.
Yeah. So I think I never watched the Sopranos until maybe 5 or 6 years ago.
Really?
When it was, I just really never was interested. Just thought, it was another mob thing, and then but everybody kept talking about it, and then. When Netflix came and whatever network is HBO, whatever, you could just stream it, and I got into it and I loved it.
Yeah, it's
because
incredible.
The son, the kid, I forget his name, but a lot of those AJ, yeah, a lot of those situations he was in, I could relate because I was, that was kind of my, early teenage years when dad was around and some of these things. So I think they did a real good job with that. And
figuring out, you're saying what your family business is.
Right.
That
right.
kind of
right.
thing.
That, right. The discovery and realization of what was going on. So, and then the way he treated his daughter as the princess, my dad definitely, there was no equal distribution. It was there. He had a favorite, and it was clear. It was my sister, right?
That's funny.
So nobody ever doubted that, and you could see that in The Sopranos. There were some parallels, and I think they did a good job with it. So
yeah, and without going into names though, like obviously you were never around this life or in it, but do you, because you're literally a Bonanno, like in the face as well? Is there any way that there's some guys who are in it today that you know, or that know you, or like when you're in town, go to dinner with you and want a good story, or vice versa, that kind of thing?
Well, yes. I mean, recently, a lot of them are, in their 90s, have been passed away, but there are still some made guys that are still around that, treat us great. They're, they might as well be blood relatives. That's how close, they are. And, they treat me great. They treat my brothers and sisters great. They're family for sure. So yes, to answer that question, there are still some guys around that, that are made guys.
I feel like the best restaurant in every city in this country.
I wish I could say that.
I get a feeling you might.
I could probably, with a few questions, a few calls, I could probably find it, right? But there are, some benefits for sure. I remember one time not too long ago, I had a business trip with a buddy, and we were in Brooklyn, and he wanted to go to Peter Luger's, and we went there. It was just packed, long wait, and called one of my dad's buddies, and he showed up, and they got us right in,
Boom.
got us a table. I mean, it's like the seas parted as soon as they saw it, as soon as they realized who it was. Right? He said who I was, and boom, we got a table. And apparently that's a big thing in Brooklyn to have walk in and get a table at Peter Luger's, but we enjoyed it
to this day.
Yeah.
Well, listen, I really appreciate you changing around your schedule and stopping through town, because you live out in Arizona.
Right.
We happened to catch you while you were somewhere else on the East Coast. So this was great, and it was also like we were moving through history, and I haven't done this in a while on the mob, so I was nerding out, and I really, really appreciate getting the chance to do it with you.
Thanks for having me, and hope we can continue this and in a mutual beneficial way.
Absolutely. And where you're going to be doing a site for the family, right? Is that going to be like its own website?
Yeah. Well, right now it's just, to sell some merchandise because, I've seen the other guys are making, it's like, why are they doing this? And then, they're making that much selling merchandise. So, I want to, over time, make this a site that will have some information for people, and we could go over different topics. But for now, it's basically an e-commerce site. It's called BonannoFamily.org.
Easy enough.
Yeah, when the internet first, well, not when it first came out, but when it started getting popular, my dad, always wanted to get that URL, BonannoFamily.org. But, back then, .org was only for, nonprofit organizations. Well, now you can use it, for anything.
General,
so that's why I picked that, that URL, because, Dad used to always joke, the organization, BonannoFamily.org. He always got a chuckle out of that. And so we're going to make a go of it.
All right, cool. Well, when you start putting some stuff on there, I think that would also help with awareness for getting people interested in doing like feature documentaries and stuff. Like if they're buying a T-shirt with the Esquire picture of your grandfather on it, that definitely has some pop culture.
Anyway, it's a start, and and we'll see where it goes from there.
Cool. Well, thank you again so much, and I hope everyone else enjoyed this as much as I did.
Right.
It was great. Everybody
you.
else, you know what it is. Give it a thought. Get back to me. Peace.